Somewhere in the quiet hours between waking and sleep, there is a doorway, and tonight that doorway opens onto a world lit by candlelight and by the last gold of a Mediterranean sun. You do not need to hold onto anything as we go through it. You do not need to remember every name or every date. All you need to do is settle more deeply into whatever surface is holding you right now. Let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and allow the centuries to drift past you like a slow river seen from a warm window. Tonight we are traveling back across 500 years, to a time when the world seemed, to the people living inside it, to be waking up after a very long sleep of its own. Historians would later give this age a name that means rebirth, and it is a fitting name, because so much that had lain dormant for centuries began, slowly and unevenly, to stir again. Old books were pulled down from monastery shelves and read with new eyes. Old buildings were studied not as ruins but as lessons. Old questions about beauty and truth and the human body and the human soul were asked again as if for the first time. But rebirths are not sudden things. They do not arrive all at once, like a light switched on in a dark room. They arrive the way morning arrives over a sleeping city, one rooftop at a time, one window at a time, until eventually the whole sky has changed color and no one can quite say when it happened. That slowness is something we can be grateful for tonight, because slowness is exactly the pace we want to travel at. There is no need to rush toward the famous names or the famous paintings. We will get to Florence and to Rome and to Venice, but we will get there the way a barge gets there, drifting along a canal in no hurry at all. So let yourself drift for a moment. Picture, if you like, a hillside in central Italy in the late afternoon. The grass has gone the color of pale honey. Rows of dark cypress trees stand very still, because there is no wind. Somewhere below, in a valley you cannot quite see, a bell is ringing to mark the hour, though you have lost track of which hour it is, and it does not matter. This is the landscape our story begins in, and it is the landscape we will return to again and again tonight, because it never really goes away. Even as we walk through crowded cities and echoing cathedrals, that quiet hillside will be waiting for us, just outside the walls, patient and green and unhurried. Let us begin. To understand why the Renaissance felt, to the people who lived through its opening years, like an awakening, we first have to spend a little time in the world it was awakening from. That world is often called, in a rather unfair shorthand, the Middle Ages, or sometimes the medieval world, as though it were simply a waiting room between two more important eras. It was not a waiting room. It was many centuries of real lives, real harvests, real wars, real prayers, real songs sung by firelight while snow fell outside. But it was also, in certain important ways, a world that looked inward and backward rather than outward and forward, and it is worth understanding why, because the Renaissance is, in large part, a story about people slowly turning their gaze in a different direction. For roughly 1,000 years before our story begins, the western half of what had once been the Roman Empire had been fragmented into smaller kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, each governed by its own lords, each defended by its own walls, each praying in its own parish church under the wide and unifying authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Learning had not vanished during these centuries, whatever old stereotypes might suggest, but it had narrowed. It lived mostly in monasteries, copied by candlelight onto vellum by monks whose patience we can only imagine, and it concerned itself mostly with theology, with the nature of God, with the correct interpretation of Scripture. The great pagan writers of Greece and Rome, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Ovid, were not entirely forgotten, but they were read selectively, filtered through Christian commentary, kept at arm's length like guests whose opinions might be interesting but could not quite be trusted. Cities, too, had shrunk. The vast urban populations that had once filled Roman towns with markets and theaters and public baths had thinned out over the centuries following the empire's collapse in the West, and much of Europe had become a patchwork of small villages clustered around castles or monasteries, growing their own food, rarely traveling more than a day's walk from where they were born. Trade continued, but it moved slowly, along rutted roads and difficult rivers, and a merchant's life was a life of genuine risk. And yet, even within this slower world, seeds were quietly being planted, and it is worth resting here a moment, in this in-between century, before the more famous names arrive. In the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, a handful of Italian cities had begun to do something unusual. Because of their position on the Mediterranean, cities like Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and later Florence had never fully turned their backs on trade the way some of the more isolated regions of northern Europe had. Ships still came and went. Goods still moved from the eastern Mediterranean, from Byzantium, from the Islamic world, into Italian harbors, and with those goods came something else, quieter and less visible on a ship's manifest: ideas. The Islamic world, during these same centuries, had preserved and expanded upon a great deal of the classical learning that Latin Europe had lost touch with. Scholars in Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Cairo, had translated and studied the works of Aristotle, had advanced mathematics and astronomy and medicine, had built libraries that would have astonished a visitor from Paris or London. Byzantium, the Greek-speaking eastern half of the old Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, had likewise kept alive an unbroken thread of connection to the ancient Greek world, its scholars still reading Homer and Plato in the original language, its churches still filled with mosaics whose golden light had never really gone out. Slowly, through trade, through the Crusades, through the movement of scholars and manuscripts, some of this preserved and expanded knowledge began to filter back into Western Europe. Universities were founded: Bologna, Paris, Oxford, where the works of Aristotle, newly available in fresh translations, were studied and debated. A style of philosophy called scholasticism developed, attempting to reconcile ancient reason with Christian faith, producing towering thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, whose careful, patient arguments still shape theology today. None of this, by itself, was the Renaissance, but it was the soil the Renaissance would grow from. It established, centuries before Florence became a household name, that the wisdom of the ancient world had not been lost forever, that it was recoverable, that it was worth recovering. It also established, in cities like Venice and Genoa and Pisa, and a little later Florence, a class of people who did not fit neatly into the old medieval categories of noble, priest, and peasant. These were merchants, bankers, wool traders, silk importers, men, and occasionally women, whose wealth came not from inherited land but from the risky, restless business of buying low in one port and selling high in another. And wealth of that kind, earned rather than inherited, tends to ask different questions of the world than wealth that has simply always been there. It asks, for instance, what a life well spent looks like when the old answer, "Be born noble, defend your land, pray for your soul," does not quite fit your own biography. It asks what beauty is for, when you have enough money to commission it but no ancient family chapel already full of it. It asks what human beings are capable of when you yourself have built something, a trading house, a fortune, a name, out of nothing but your own effort and cleverness. These questions, murmured quietly in the counting houses and warehouses of Italian port cities through the 12th and 13th centuries, were the first faint stirrings of the dawn we are drifting toward tonight. Nothing dramatic happened yet. No single bell rang to announce that the Middle Ages had ended and something new had begun. Centuries do not work that way, and neither really does sleep or waking. Things simply, slowly shifted. And in one city above all others, a city built on a bend of a slow green river, in the rolling hills of Tuscany, those shifts would gather themselves together into something the world had never quite seen before. Let us go there now. Picture the Arno River, wide and unhurried, moving through a valley ringed by soft Tuscan hills. On its banks, by the start of the 14th century, sat a city of perhaps 50 or 60,000 people, its skyline still low, its great dome not yet built, its narrow streets smelling of wool dye and leather and baking bread. This was Florence, and though it did not yet know it, it was about to become one of the most consequential cities in the history of art, thought, and human self-understanding. Florence's initial claim to importance was not artistic. It was economic. By the 13th century, Florentine merchants and bankers had built one of the most sophisticated financial systems in Europe. They dealt in wool, importing raw fleece from as far away as England and Spain, transforming it in Florentine workshops into fine dyed cloth that could be sold across the continent at enormous markup. The guild that controlled this trade, the Arte della Lana, became one of the most powerful institutions in the city, its wealth-funding churches, public buildings, and eventually art on a scale that would astonish later centuries. Florentine bankers, meanwhile, had pioneered techniques of accounting and credit that allowed money to move safely across long distances without physically transporting gold. The florin, the city's gold coin, first minted in 1252, became something like an international currency, accepted and trusted from London to Constantinople. This mattered enormously, because it meant that Florence, a city with no great natural resources, no gold mines, no especially fertile farmland beyond what the Tuscan countryside could offer, became staggeringly wealthy simply through the movement and management of other people's money. It is worth resting here in your mind on the strangeness and the modernity of that fact. Florence's power did not come from conquest, in the way that Rome's had, or from a king's inherited domain, in the way that Paris's had. It came from ledgers, from careful bookkeeping, from a network of trust between merchants who might never meet each other but who honored letters of credit across 1,000 miles. In a sense, Florence's wealth was built out of an idea, the idea that a promise, properly documented, could be as good as gold. And it is fitting, perhaps, that a city built on the power of ideas would go on to become a city that changed the world through ideas of an entirely different kind. The city governed itself, at least in theory, as a republic, though in practice power was concentrated among a fairly narrow circle of wealthy families who filled its councils and committees. Politics in Florence was fierce, factional, and occasionally violent. Families feuded, exiled rivals, and sometimes returned from exile to feud again. But the underlying structure was one of civic participation, of citizens who saw themselves not as subjects of a distant king but as members of a self-governing community. This mattered for what was to come because it produced a particular kind of educated, urban, civic-minded elite. Men who needed to write persuasive speeches for the city council, who needed to understand law and rhetoric and history, who needed, in short, exactly the kind of education that the ancient Romans had once prized. And this is where our story finds its first true hinge. In the early 14th century, a Florentine poet and scholar named Francesco Petrarca, whom we know today as Petrarch, began to do something that seems small but that historians now regard as one of the opening acts of the entire Renaissance. He began systematically searching monastery libraries across Europe for lost or forgotten manuscripts of ancient Roman authors, copying them out by hand, studying their Latin not as a dead language to be mined for theological proof texts but as a living, beautiful form of expression to be imitated and loved for its own sake. Petrarch was, by profession, a kind of wandering scholar and poet, supported at various points by wealthy patrons and church offices, and he traveled widely across Italy and France in search of these manuscripts. In 1345, in a library in Verona, he made one of his most famous discoveries, a collection of letters written by the Roman statesman and orator Cicero to his friend Atticus, letters that revealed Cicero not as a distant marble bust but as a real, anxious, ambitious, sometimes petty human being, worrying about his career, his debts, his political rivals. For Petrarch, this discovery was electrifying. Here was proof that the ancient world had been populated by people, not simply by moral exempla in old textbooks, but by actual individuals with actual inner lives, whose thoughts and feelings could still, across 13 centuries, be recovered and understood. Petrarch began to think of the many centuries between the fall of Rome and his own time as a kind of dark age, a period of intellectual decline, and he began to imagine his own era as the beginning of a return to the light, a rebirth, though he did not yet use that exact word, of the wisdom and eloquence of the ancient world. This idea, that classical antiquity represented a kind of golden age of human achievement that had been lost and could now be recovered, is the intellectual seed from which nearly everything else in our story grows. It gave later generations a name for what they were doing, a sense of purpose, a feeling that they were not simply living their lives but participating in a grand historical project of recovery and renewal. Petrarch's love of the ancient world was not merely academic. He wrote his own poetry, most famously a long sequence of sonnets addressed to a woman he called Laura, whom he had apparently glimpsed once in a church in Avignon and loved, in the elaborate courtly fashion of the age, from a respectful and permanent distance for the rest of his life. These poems, written in Italian rather than Latin, helped establish the Tuscan dialect as a literary language of enormous sophistication and beauty, a language capable of expressing the most delicate shades of longing and observation. Dante Alighieri, a Florentine slightly older than Petrarch, had already done something similar a generation earlier with his Divine Comedy, an epic journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise written in the same Tuscan Italian rather than the Latin that a more conservative poet might have chosen. Between Dante and Petrarch, and a third great Florentine writer, Giovanni Boccaccio, whose Decameron collected 100 vivid, worldly, often funny short stories supposedly told by a group of young Florentines sheltering from the plague, the Italian language itself was being forged into an instrument of extraordinary literary power. And it is worth pausing on that detail, sheltering from the plague, because the 14th century, the very century in which these seeds of renewal were being planted, was also a century of almost unimaginable devastation. In 1348, the Black Death swept through Florence and the rest of Europe, killing, by most estimates, somewhere between a third and a half of the city's population within a matter of months. Boccaccio, who witnessed it, described bodies left unburied in the streets, families abandoning their own sick, the entire fabric of social trust fraying under the weight of terror and grief. It seems strange, perhaps, that a period of such catastrophic loss should also be a period from which such vigorous new growth would eventually spring, but historians have long noted the connection. The plague, devastating as it was, also reshuffled the economic deck. Land and capital that had been divided among many heirs became concentrated in fewer hands, as whole family lines were wiped out. Labor, suddenly scarce, became more valuable, and surviving workers and craftsmen found themselves in a stronger bargaining position than before. And perhaps, too, there was a psychological dimension. Societies that have stared closely at death sometimes respond, once the worst is past, with a fierce, urgent appetite for life, for beauty, for meaning, for building things that will outlast the fragile human body. Whatever the precise mixture of causes, the century following the plague, the 15th century, would become the century in which Florence transformed itself from a wealthy trading city into something closer to a workshop of the human spirit, a place where a new way of thinking about the individual, about beauty, about the possibilities of human achievement, would take on physical form in bronze, in marble, in fresco, and in stone. We will spend a great deal of time in that workshop tonight. But first, let us rest for a moment on the hillside above the city, and let the details of history soften into the wider, calmer landscape of this moment, before we descend again into the streets and squares where it all took place. Let your eyes stay closed. Let the bells of the Arno Valley ring faintly in the distance. There is no need to hold on to any of these names too tightly. They will return, gently, when it is time. Before we walk further into Florence's streets, it is worth spending a little time with an idea, because the Renaissance, more than almost any other historical period, was driven forward by an idea before it was expressed in stone or paint. That idea is usually called humanism, and it is one of those historical terms that has drifted somewhat in meaning over the centuries, so it is worth being gentle and precise about what it meant to the people who first practiced it. Renaissance humanism was not, in its original form, a rejection of religion, as the modern word humanist might sometimes suggest today. Almost every humanist scholar of the 14th and 15th centuries was a devout Christian, many of them clergy, and their study of pagan Roman and Greek literature coexisted, often quite comfortably, with sincere religious faith. What humanism meant in its own time was something more specific. A course of study, the Studia Humanitatis, that centered on grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, all drawn primarily from classical Latin and increasingly Greek sources. It was, in other words, an educational program, a way of training the mind, and it stood in some tension with the university curriculum of the previous centuries, which had emphasized logic, theology, and the technical philosophy of scholasticism. Where scholastic education asked, essentially, how can human reason help us understand and defend divine truth, humanist education asked a subtly different question. How can the wisdom of history's great writers and orators help us live well, speak persuasively, and govern wisely, here in this world, in this life? It was an education oriented toward action, toward civic life, toward the practical business of being a good citizen, a good administrator, a good and eloquent human being. And it was, crucially, an education that took human experience itself, human emotion, human ambition, human curiosity, human capacity for both virtue and folly, as a subject worthy of serious, sustained attention, rather than simply a fallen state to be transcended through prayer. This shift in emphasis had enormous consequences, many of which would only become visible generations later. If human life itself was worthy of careful study and celebration, then human faces were worth painting with individual, specific likeness rather than generic religious symbolism. Human bodies were worth studying anatomically, worth sculpting with an accuracy that revealed muscle and bone beneath skin. Human achievements, a well-run city, a well-designed building, a well-argued speech, were worthy of praise in their own right, not merely as reflections of divine glory but as genuine accomplishments of human intelligence and effort. One of the great early humanist scholars, Coluccio Salutati, served for over 30 years as Chancellor of Florence, effectively the city's chief diplomat and propagandist, and he used his classical education directly in the service of the Florentine Republic, writing letters and manifestos that framed Florence's political struggles against its rivals in the elevated, persuasive language of ancient Roman oratory. It is said, with perhaps some exaggeration, that the ruler of Milan, Florence's great rival, once remarked that a single letter from Salutati's pen did more damage to Milan's cause than 1,000 cavalrymen. Whether or not the story is precisely true, it captures something real. That in Florence, eloquence, classical learning, and political power had become deeply intertwined. Salutati's intellectual heir, a scholar named Leonardo Bruni, took this project even further. Bruni, who also served as Chancellor of Florence, wrote a history of the Florentine people modeled explicitly on the works of the ancient Roman historians, presenting Florence's republican government as the direct spiritual descendant of the Roman Republic, a free city of citizens governing themselves through law and reasoned debate, in contrast to what he portrayed as the tyranny of hereditary monarchs elsewhere in Europe. This was, in part, useful political propaganda for a city often at war with more autocratic neighbors, but it was also a genuinely new way of thinking about history. Not as a simple chronicle of kings and popes, but as the story of a people, a civic community, whose freedoms and achievements were worth studying and defending. Bruni also did something else that mattered enormously for the transmission of ancient wisdom. Alongside a small circle of other scholars, he helped bring the study of ancient Greek back into Western European intellectual life. For centuries, knowledge of Greek had been almost entirely lost in Western Europe outside of a few isolated pockets. Even highly educated scholars typically knew Aristotle and Plato only through Latin translations, some of them centuries old and imperfect. In 1397, the city of Florence invited a Byzantine scholar named Manuel Chrysoloras to come and teach Greek, and his arrival is often marked as a turning point. Suddenly, a small but growing circle of Florentine humanists could read Plato, Homer, and the Greek tragedians in their original language, and the philosophical riches of Plato in particular. His emphasis on ideal forms, on the soul's capacity to ascend toward beauty and truth, on love as a ladder reaching from physical attraction toward divine contemplation, would go on to shape Renaissance thought and art for the next 2 centuries. It is worth sitting with this image for a moment. A handful of Florentine merchants' sons, gathered in a room, painstakingly learning an alphabet and grammar that had been essentially unknown in their city for 1,000 years, driven by nothing more than curiosity and a hunger for wisdom they suspected was waiting for them just beyond the edge of what they already knew. There is something deeply moving in that image, something that captures the entire spirit of the Renaissance more intimately, perhaps, than any painting or statue could. It was, at its heart, a movement of people who believed that understanding could still be expanded, that the boundaries of human knowledge were not fixed, that the past held gifts still waiting to be unwrapped. This hunger for classical texts also drove one of the quieter but more consequential achievements of the era: the systematic search for and preservation of ancient manuscripts. Wealthy patrons funded expeditions to monastery libraries across Europe, seeking out crumbling, worm-eaten copies of texts that might otherwise have been lost forever to damp, fire, or simple neglect. A scholar named Poggio Bracciolini, traveling to monasteries in Switzerland and Germany in the early 15th century, recovered previously unknown or nearly extinct texts by Roman authors such as Lucretius, Quintilian, and Cicero, works whose ideas would ripple outward through European thought for centuries. Lucretius's poem on the nature of things, in particular, containing as it did a materialist, almost scientific vision of atoms and a universe without divine intervention, would later influence thinkers far beyond the Renaissance itself. None of this recovery work was fast, or easy, or guaranteed. Manuscripts were fragile. Travel was slow and often dangerous. Many texts we know were written in antiquity are lost to us still, their final copies having crumbled to dust in some forgotten library before a Poggio Bracciolini could reach them. But enough survived, and enough was found, that by the middle of the 15th century, an educated Florentine could read more of the classical world's philosophy, poetry, oratory, and history than any European had been able to read in nearly 1,000 years. And all of this recovered wisdom needed somewhere to live, needed patrons willing to fund the copying of manuscripts, the founding of libraries, the employment of scholars and translators, and, eventually, the commissioning of art that would give this new humanist vision of the world a visible, physical form. Florence, fortunately for the history of civilization, possessed exactly such patrons, and it is to the most famous of these families that we turn next. Rest here a moment longer. Picture candlelight falling across a page of Greek letters, a scholar's hand moving slowly, transcribing wisdom that had waited, patient and silent, for 1,000 years to be read again. No family name is more closely associated with the flowering of Renaissance Florence than the Medici, and it is worth spending time understanding not just who they were, but how an ordinary, if unusually capable, banking family came to shape the cultural destiny of an entire city, and in some ways an entire civilization. The Medici rose to prominence in the late 14th and early 15th centuries through banking, much like many of Florence's other great families, but they distinguished themselves through a particular combination of financial shrewdness and, eventually, political caution. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, who founded the family's banking fortune in the late 14th century, built the Medici Bank into one of the most successful financial institutions in Europe, with branches eventually stretching from London to Rome to Bruges. Giovanni was, by most accounts, a careful and somewhat modest man who avoided ostentatious displays of political power even as his wealth grew, and he counseled his son to do the same, reportedly advising him to stay out of the public eye as much as possible and to avoid appearing to dictate to the city's other powerful families. That son, Cosimo de' Medici, inherited both his father's fortune and, eventually, his father's caution, though history would remember him for something far more visible: his transformation into one of the great patrons of art and learning in human history. Cosimo, who came to dominate Florentine politics from the 1430s until his death in 1464, never held formal dictatorial power and never abolished the city's republican institutions, but he exercised such enormous influence behind the scenes, through alliances, favors, and financial leverage, that he became, in effect, the city's unofficial ruler. He was careful never to look like a prince, always presenting himself as merely a leading citizen among equals, but the reality of his power was well understood by everyone in Florence and far beyond it. What makes Cosimo remarkable for our purposes tonight is not his political skill but his patronage. He used his vast wealth to fund an extraordinary range of cultural and intellectual projects. He funded the search for ancient manuscripts, and when a Greek scholar named Gemistus Plethen visited Florence in 1439 for a church council and gave a series of lectures on Plato's philosophy, Cosimo was reportedly so captivated that he resolved to found an academy devoted to the study of Plato's works. This resolution eventually took shape as the Platonic Academy, a loose circle of scholars centered around the brilliant translator and philosopher Marsilio Ficino, whom Cosimo commissioned to translate the complete works of Plato from Greek into Latin, along with the mystical writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Ficino would spend much of his life on this project, eventually producing translations that would introduce the full range of Plato's philosophy to Western Europe for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, and his own philosophical writings, blending Platonism with Christian theology, would deeply influence the artists and thinkers of the following generations. Cosimo also funded architecture and art on a monumental scale. He commissioned the architect Michelangelo to design a new family palace, the Palazzo Medici, whose rusticated stone facade would become a template for Florentine palace architecture for generations. He funded the rebuilding and expansion of the monastery of San Marco, commissioning the painter and Dominican friar Fra Angelico to fill its quiet cells with serene, luminous frescoes of biblical scenes, images meant not for public display but for the private contemplation of the monks who lived and prayed among them. He supported the sculptor Donatello for decades, funding some of the most innovative and influential sculptures of the entire Renaissance. And notably, Cosimo funded a public library at San Marco, one of the first libraries in Europe since antiquity to be open, at least in principle, to any scholar who wished to consult its books, a small but significant step toward the idea that knowledge should circulate rather than remain locked away in private hands. It would be easy to view all this patronage cynically, as simply a wealthy man's attempt to launder the reputation of a family whose fortune came, after all, from banking, an occupation the medieval church had traditionally viewed with some suspicion due to concerns about usury. There is probably some truth in that reading. Cosimo was a shrewd political operator, and burnishing the Medici name through visible acts of piety and civic generosity certainly served his family's long-term interests. But it would be a mistake to reduce his patronage to mere calculation. The letters and accounts that survive suggest a man who took genuine personal pleasure in scholarship and beauty, who enjoyed nothing more than sitting with Ficino discussing Platonic philosophy, who visited the workshops of the artists he supported and took real interest in their work. Whatever mixture of motives drove him, the effect was transformative. Florence, under Cosimo's quiet influence, became a magnet for talent, a place where a gifted painter, sculptor, or scholar could find not just work but genuine appreciation and support. Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, who came to lead the family and the city in 1469 at the young age of 20, would take this tradition of patronage even further, and it is Lorenzo whom history remembers by the epithet Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. Lorenzo inherited a difficult political situation. Florence's rivalries with other Italian states remained sharp, and in 1478 Lorenzo himself narrowly survived an assassination attempt during Mass in the city's cathedral, an event known as the Puzzi Conspiracy, in which his younger brother Giuliano was murdered at the altar. Lorenzo's political skill in the aftermath of this crisis, both in suppressing the conspiracy at home and in navigating the diplomatic fallout across Italy, secured his position for the remainder of his life, and under his rule Florence enjoyed roughly 15 years of relative peace and prosperity, remembered by later generations, with some nostalgic exaggeration, as a golden age. Lorenzo was himself a genuinely accomplished poet, writing verse in the Tuscan vernacular that later critics would rank among the finest of the century, capable of both delicate pastoral lyricism and earthy, comic verse celebrating the pleasures of food, wine, and carnival. He continued his grandfather's support of the Platonic Academy, gathering around himself an extraordinary circle of poets, philosophers, and artists, including the philosopher Pico della Mirandola, a young nobleman of dazzling intellectual ambition who, at the age of 23, proposed to defend 900 theses drawn from Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic sources in a public debate in Rome, and who wrote, as an introduction to this project, an essay now known as the Oration on the Dignity of Man, often cited as one of the great manifestos of Renaissance humanist thought. In it, Pico imagined God addressing the newly created Adam, telling him that unlike every other creature, whose nature was fixed and bound, humanity alone had been given no fixed nature at all, but the freedom to shape itself, through its own choices, into whatever it wished to become, rising toward the divine or sinking toward the bestial, according to its own will. It is a soaring, optimistic vision of human freedom and potential, and it captures, as well as any single document could, the animating spirit of the age we are traveling through tonight. Lorenzo also supported a young sculptor and painter whose name would eventually eclipse almost every other artist in history, a boy from the nearby town of Vinci whom Lorenzo employed in his household and eventually recommended to the ruler of Milan. But that story, the story of Leonardo, deserves its own quiet chapter later tonight, and we will come to it in its proper, unhurried time. For now, let us simply rest in this image. A city transformed, over the course of 2 generations, by the patient patronage of a single banking family, who used their fortune not simply to accumulate more fortune, but to fund libraries, academies, churches, palaces, and workshops, creating the conditions in which some of the greatest achievements in the history of art and thought could take root and grow. Wealth, in Renaissance Florence, had found a new purpose. Not merely display, though there was certainly plenty of that too, but the patient cultivation of beauty and wisdom for their own sake. Let your breathing slow further. The candles of the Medici library are burning low. Somewhere in the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici, a young sculptor is sketching by moonlight. We will meet him soon. Every great transformation needs a symbol, some single, visible achievement that later generations can point to and say, here, in this object, we can see the change beginning to take physical shape. For the Florentine Renaissance, that symbol rises above the city's rooftops even today, a vast red-tiled dome crowning the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, visible from every hillside for miles around, and the story of how it came to be built is, in its own quiet way, as remarkable as any painting or poem the era produced. The cathedral itself had been under construction since the end of the 13th century, its nave and walls rising slowly over more than a century of intermittent building, funded by the Wool Merchants Guild and by the city's civic pride. But by the early 15th century, the building faced an enormous, almost embarrassing problem. The cathedral's design called for an octagonal dome spanning an opening more than 140 feet across, far wider than any dome that had been successfully built since antiquity. No one, in over 100 years since the cathedral's design had been approved, had figured out how such a dome could actually be constructed. Traditional building techniques required elaborate wooden scaffolding rising from the ground to support a dome while it was being built, but a gap of this size would have required more timber than the forests of Tuscany could reasonably supply, and even if the timber could be found, no one was confident that scaffolding of that scale could bear its own weight, let alone the weight of the stone and brick above it. For decades, the cathedral simply sat there, its great gap open to the sky, a visible daily reminder of a problem no one could solve. Then, in 1418, the cathedral's overseers announced a public competition, inviting any architect or engineer with a proposed solution to submit a model demonstrating how the dome might be built. Among those who submitted a proposal was a Florentine goldsmith and clockmaker named Filippo Brunelleschi, a man in his early 40s with no formal training in architecture, who had spent much of the previous decade in Rome, ostensibly studying sculpture but in fact spending a great deal of his time crawling among the ruins of ancient Roman buildings, measuring their proportions, studying the engineering of the Pantheon's enormous dome, and puzzling out, largely through his own patient observation, principles of construction that had not been practiced in Europe for 1,000 years. Brunelleschi's proposal was audacious. He suggested that the dome could be built without traditional scaffolding at all, using instead a herringbone brick pattern that would allow each ring of the dome to support itself as it was laid, along with a system of interlocking wooden and stone ribs and chains that would bind the structure together and prevent it from spreading outward under its own weight, the way an arch might otherwise collapse. He proposed, in effect, a dome within a dome, an inner shell and an outer shell, connected by a hidden structural framework between them, distributing the enormous forces involved in ways that no one in Florence had ever attempted. The cathedral's overseers were, understandably, deeply skeptical. Brunelleschi, by most accounts a proud and somewhat prickly man, refused for a long time to fully explain his methods, fearing that his ideas would be stolen by rival architects, which led to considerable frustration among the officials evaluating his proposal. Legend holds that at one point, asked to demonstrate his engineering genius, Brunelleschi challenged the assembled architects to make an egg stand upright on a flat marble surface. When each of them failed, he simply tapped the egg's bottom gently against the marble, cracking it just enough to let it stand, and when the others complained that they too could have done that if they had known the trick, he replied that they would say the same thing once they saw how he intended to build the dome. Whether or not this particular story is precisely true, it captures something of Brunelleschi's characteristic blend of confidence, secrecy, and genuine, hard-won ingenuity. Eventually, despite considerable political maneuvering, rivalry with a fellow sculptor named Lorenzo Ghiberti, who was initially appointed as his co-supervisor, and repeated challenges to his authority over the project, Brunelleschi's design was adopted, and construction on the dome began in earnest in 1420. The project would occupy him for the rest of his working life. He designed and built entirely new machines to solve problems as they arose. Massive ox-powered hoists capable of lifting enormous loads of stone and brick to previously unimaginable heights, a reversible gear mechanism that allowed a single hoist to both raise and lower loads without unharnessing and reharnessing the oxen each time, and specialized boats and carts for transporting marble and other materials along the Arno and through the city's streets. He designed housing and even a kind of canteen atop the rising dome itself, so that workers would not need to climb up and down the scaffolding multiple times a day, and he is said to have watered the workers' wine to prevent accidents caused by drunkenness at such dangerous heights. The dome rose, ring by ring, brick by herringbone brick, over the course of 16 years, an engineering achievement that drew visitors from across Europe who simply wanted to see, with their own eyes, whether the thing could really be built the way Brunelleschi claimed. When it was finally completed in 1436, and consecrated with an enormous public celebration, it stood as the largest masonry dome ever constructed, a record it would hold for centuries, and it remains, to this day, the largest brick dome in the world. But Brunelleschi's significance for our story extends beyond the dome itself, remarkable as that achievement was. Around the same period, likely in the first decade of the 15th century, Brunelleschi is also credited with formally working out the mathematical principles of linear perspective, the technique by which a flat painted surface can be made to convincingly represent three-dimensional space receding into the distance, with parallel lines appearing to converge toward a single vanishing point on the horizon. According to accounts written decades later, Brunelleschi demonstrated this principle through a remarkable experiment. He painted a small panel depicting the Florence baptistry as seen from a specific viewpoint just inside the cathedral's main doors, drilled a small hole through the panel at the vanishing point, and instructed viewers to look through the hole from behind the panel while holding a mirror in front of it, reflecting the painted image back at them. Because the painting had been constructed with mathematically precise perspective, and because a real building of known dimensions stood in exactly that spot for comparison, viewers reported being unable to tell, at certain angles, whether they were looking at the painted panel or the real building itself. This discovery of mathematical, geometrically consistent perspective would transform painting forever. Where medieval art had generally represented space symbolically, sizing figures according to their spiritual importance rather than their physical distance from the viewer, and arranging scenes according to narrative logic rather than optical accuracy, Renaissance art, beginning with Brunelleschi's principles and rapidly adopted and refined by painters across Florence, could now construct convincing illusions of real, measurable, three-dimensional space on a flat surface. A painted room could look like a real room you might walk into. A painted procession of figures could seem to recede convincingly into painted distance. This was not merely a technical trick, it reflected a deeper shift in how people were beginning to think about the visible world, as something that could be measured, understood through mathematics, and represented with a new kind of rational precision, even as it was also, simultaneously, being celebrated for its beauty and emotional power. It is worth noting, too, the character of Brunelleschi's achievement more broadly. A man trained as a goldsmith, self-taught in ancient engineering through years of patient, unpaid observation among Roman ruins, solving a problem that had defeated professional architects for over a century, through a combination of careful study of the past and genuinely original invention for the present. This combination, reverence for ancient wisdom paired with bold, practical innovation, is in many ways the essential creative formula of the entire Renaissance, and Brunelleschi's dome, rising serene and enormous above the rooftops of Florence, remains one of its clearest and most enduring expressions. If you find yourself picturing that dome now, glowing faintly orange in the last light of a Tuscan evening, let the image settle. There is nothing more to solve tonight. The dome is finished. It has stood for nearly 600 years, and it will still be standing quiet and complete when morning comes. While Brunelleschi solved the mathematics of space, a slightly younger Florentine named Donatello was solving an equally difficult problem in a different medium. How to bring the human body back to life in bronze and marble, after nearly 1,000 years in which European sculpture had, for the most part, lost touch with the anatomical naturalism and psychological depth that ancient Greek and Roman sculptors had once achieved. Donatello, born around 1386, trained in his youth alongside other young artists in the workshop culture of Florence, and like Brunelleschi, he traveled to Rome as a young man to study the surviving ruins and sculptures of antiquity firsthand. What he found there seems to have affected him as deeply as it affected his older colleague. Ancient statues, even fragmentary and weathered ones, showed the human body not as a stiff symbolic representation of a spiritual truth, in the manner of much medieval sculpture, but as a living, weighted, breathing thing, with muscles that responded to the pull of gravity, with a naturalistic sense of how weight shifts through hips and shoulders when a figure stands at rest, with faces capable of expressing genuine individual emotion rather than generic serenity. Donatello set about recovering and extending this ancient naturalism with extraordinary skill and, at times, startling originality. Around 1408, working in marble, he carved a statue of the young shepherd King David for the Florence Cathedral, portraying him as a somewhat awkward, adolescent figure, his weight resting naturally on one hip in a pose the ancient Greeks had called contrapposto, a subtle twisting counterbalance through the body that Donatello had studied in classical sculpture and reintroduced into European art for the first time in centuries. This early marble David was thoughtful and restrained, but Donatello would return to the same biblical subject decades later with a work of far greater daring. Sometime in the 1440s, likely commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici for the courtyard of the new Medici Palace, Donatello cast a bronze statue of David that remains, to this day, one of the most startling and discussed works of the entire Renaissance. Unlike his earlier marble version, this David is entirely nude except for a shepherd's hat and a pair of boots, his youthful, slender body rendered with an almost tender sensuousness, one foot resting casually on the severed head of the giant Goliath, a faint private smile playing on his lips. It was, as far as we know, the first freestanding, life-sized nude bronze statue produced in Europe since antiquity, and its combination of biblical subject matter with frankly celebrated physical beauty and unmistakable homoerotic undertones has fascinated and puzzled scholars for centuries. What is certain is that Donatello had, in this single work, fully reclaimed something that medieval art had largely set aside: the idea that the naked human body, rendered with anatomical truth and sensuous grace, could be a fitting subject for serious, even devotional art. Donatello's innovations extended well beyond a single statue. He pioneered a technique of very shallow relief carving known as schiacciato, or flattened, in which figures and architectural settings emerge from the marble with barely perceptible depth, and yet, through masterful control of perspective and modeling, appear to recede into convincing atmospheric distance, almost like a drawing rendered in stone. He created haunting, emotionally raw depictions of later biblical scenes, including a wooden sculpture of Mary Magdalene in extreme old age, her body wasted by decades of penitential fasting in the wilderness, her face a mask of gaunt, weathered grief, a work so unflinching in its portrayal of physical decay and spiritual anguish that it stands in stark contrast to the youthful, idealized beauty of his bronze David, demonstrating the astonishing range Donatello commanded across an extraordinarily long and productive career. He also produced what is generally considered the first great equestrian monument of the Renaissance, a bronze statue of the mercenary military commander Erasmo de Narni, known as Gadamelita, mounted astride a powerfully muscled horse, commissioned for the city of Padua and completed in the 1450s. The statue drew directly on ancient Roman equestrian monuments, particularly the surviving bronze statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in Rome, which throughout the Middle Ages had been mistakenly believed to represent the Christian Emperor Constantine and was therefore one of the few ancient bronzes never melted down for its metal. Donatello's Gadamelita monument re-established, for the first time in 1,000 years, the ancient tradition of honoring a great commander with a monumental bronze portrait astride his horse, a tradition that would be revived again and again by later sculptors across Europe for centuries to come. What unites all of Donatello's diverse work, from the tender youth of his bronze David to the ravaged old age of his wooden Magdalene, is a commitment to psychological and physical truth that had simply not existed in European sculpture for centuries. His figures do not merely represent religious or historical subjects in a generalized symbolic way. They seem to have specific inner lives, specific emotional states, specific relationships to gravity and weight and age. This achievement, quiet and gradual as it may have seemed at the time, represented nothing less than the recovery of an entire lost tradition of representing the human being as a physical, particular, individual creature, worthy of the same careful, loving attention that ancient sculptors had once given it, and worthy, too, of carrying the full weight of religious and emotional meaning that Christian art demanded. Donatello worked for decades under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, who reportedly considered him one of his dearest friends, and who, according to tradition, arranged for Donatello to be buried, upon his death in 1466, in the church of San Lorenzo, close to Cosimo's own tomb, a final gesture of affection and respect between patron and artist that speaks to the genuine personal bonds that could form within Florence's culture of patronage. Donatello's innovations in bronze casting, in marble carving, in the expression of psychological depth and physical naturalism, would influence virtually every sculptor who came after him, and his long life, spanning from the earliest years of the Renaissance's Florentine flowering into its later, more elaborate phases, makes him something like a living thread connecting the movement's tentative beginnings to its confident maturity. Let the bronze cool now in your imagination. Somewhere in a quiet Florentine courtyard, moonlight falls across a young shepherd's slender bronze shoulders, and the city sleeps on around him, unaware, or perhaps simply unbothered, that something entirely new has quietly come to stand among them. There are certain names that, across the long span of human history, seem to gather to themselves an almost mythical quality, and Leonardo da Vinci is perhaps the clearest example of this phenomenon within the Renaissance. Yet it is worth approaching him tonight not through the myth, but through the unhurried, patient reality of an actual human life, a life defined less by sudden genius than by an almost boundless, restless curiosity that pulled his attention in 100 directions at once. Leonardo was born in 1452 in the small Tuscan town of Vinci, the illegitimate son of a Florentine notary and a local peasant woman, a circumstance that, in an unexpected way, may have shaped the course of his life. Because he could not, as an illegitimate child, follow his father into the respectable, guild-regulated profession of notary, he was instead apprenticed, in his mid-teens, to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence, a highly regarded painter and sculptor who trained numerous young artists in the full range of skills a Renaissance workshop demanded. Mixing pigments, preparing panels, casting bronze, carving marble, and eventually painting alongside the master himself on important commissions. It was in Verrocchio's workshop that Leonardo's early talent first became visible to those around him. According to a story recorded by the artist and biographer Giorgio Vasari, writing several decades later, Verrocchio was working on a painting of the baptism of Christ and asked his young apprentice to paint one of the angels in the corner of the composition. Leonardo's angel, the story goes, was rendered with such delicacy, such lifelike grace, that Verrocchio, upon seeing it, was so humbled by the gap between his own skill and his students that he resolved never to paint again. This story is almost certainly exaggerated, in the way that such origin stories often are, but the surviving painting does show a striking contrast between Verrocchio's more conventional figures and one particular angel, turned in three-quarter profile, rendered with an almost ethereal softness that does indeed seem to anticipate the mature Leonardo's later style. What made Leonardo's approach to painting so distinctive, even at this early stage, was his interest in what came to be called sfumato, an Italian word meaning something like smoked or vanished, describing a technique of blending colors and tones so gradually and softly that no hard edges or visible transitions remain, allowing forms to melt into one another the way objects seem to soften at the edges when seen through a light haze, or the way our own eyes actually perceive gradations of light and shadow rather than crisp outlines. This technique would become one of the defining features of Leonardo's mature work, giving his figures an uncanny sense of atmospheric depth and living, breathing presence. But painting, for all the fame it would eventually bring him, occupied only a portion of Leonardo's restless attention. From a young age, he filled notebook after notebook, thousands of pages in total across his lifetime, with an almost overwhelming range of observations, sketches, and inventions. He studied the flight of birds in painstaking detail, filling pages with diagrams of wing structures and airflow, in pursuit of a dream of human flight that would not become technically achievable for another 400 years. He studied the flow of water in rivers and canals, observing and sketching the swirling patterns of turbulence with a precision that modern fluid dynamicists still find remarkable. He dissected human and animal cadavers over the course of many years and at considerable personal risk given the Church's ambivalence toward such practices, producing anatomical drawings of muscles, bones, and internal organs of such accuracy that some of them were not surpassed by scientific illustration for centuries afterward. He sketched designs for machines that would not be built for centuries: a rudimentary helicopter, a parachute, an armored fighting vehicle resembling a very early tank, a diving suit, elaborate systems of gears and pulleys for lifting weights or transmitting mechanical power. Most of these designs were never built during his lifetime, existing only as ideas on paper, some of them impractical given the materials and engineering knowledge available to him, but they reveal a mind that moved fluidly and without hesitation between the world of art and the world of engineering, seeing no meaningful boundary between the two. For Leonardo, understanding how a bird's wing achieved lift and understanding how to paint the delicate translucency of skin were simply two expressions of the same underlying discipline: the patient, careful observation of how the natural world actually worked. This restless curiosity had its costs. Leonardo was notorious, even among his contemporaries, for leaving projects unfinished, for accepting commissions and then abandoning them for years at a time while his attention wandered toward some new fascination, for experimenting with unproven techniques that sometimes led to disastrous results, as when a fresco he attempted in Milan using an experimental oil-based technique on a dining hall wall began deteriorating within his own lifetime. That particular fresco, however, happened to be the Last Supper, painted for the refectory of the monastery of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan in the late 1490s, and despite its unfortunate physical deterioration over the centuries, it remains one of the most studied and beloved paintings in the history of art, celebrated for the extraordinary psychological drama captured in the reactions of the 12 apostles at the moment Christ announces that one of them will betray him. Leonardo organized the apostles into 4 groups of 3, each figure caught in a distinct, individualized emotional response: shock, denial, anger, quiet grief, creating a single frozen moment that nonetheless seems to ripple with movement and human feeling, as if you have caught the scene in the exact instant between one heartbeat and the next. Leonardo spent nearly 2 decades of his working life in Milan, in the service of the ruling Sforza family, for whom he worked not primarily as a painter but as a kind of court engineer, designing weapons, fortifications, festival decorations, and elaborate stage machinery for court entertainments, alongside occasional painting commissions. He also spent years attempting to design and cast an enormous bronze equestrian monument honoring the Sforza dynasty, a project so ambitious in scale that the full-sized clay model alone, according to contemporary accounts, astonished all who saw it, though the bronze casting itself was never completed, as the metal that had been stockpiled for the project was instead melted down into cannons when Milan came under threat of French invasion in the 1490s, and the clay model itself was later destroyed by French soldiers using it for target practice, a poignant reminder of how much of Leonardo's most ambitious work existed only briefly, or only in his notebooks, before being lost to the ordinary destructive chaos of history. Toward the end of his life, after years of moving between Florence, Milan, and Rome, Leonardo accepted an invitation from the young King Francis I of France to come and live in a manor house near the royal court at Amboise, where he spent his final years, still sketching, still filling notebooks with observations, still, according to some accounts, working on refinements to the small portrait he had carried with him for years and never quite considered finished, a painting of a Florentine merchant's wife, seated with her hands folded, a faint, ambiguous expression playing across her lips, which we know today as the Mona Lisa. This painting, perhaps the most famous single artwork in the history of the world, exemplifies everything that made Leonardo's approach so revolutionary. The soft atmospheric sfumato blending of light and shadow, the subtle, psychologically complex expression that seems to shift depending on how and where you look at it, the carefully observed, almost geological landscape receding into a hazy, dreamlike distance behind the sitter, reflecting Leonardo's genuine scientific interest in rock formations and erosion. Leonardo died at Amboise in 1519, and legend holds, though the story is likely a later embellishment, that King Francis himself was present at his deathbed, cradling the great artist's head. What is certain is that Leonardo left behind an almost unmanageable quantity of unfinished projects, scattered notebooks, and unrealized dreams, alongside a small handful of paintings so carefully considered, so patiently perfected, that they continue to be studied and marveled at more than 500 years later. He was, in the end, less a man who finished things than a man who looked endlessly and patiently at everything around him, convinced that if he only looked closely enough for long enough, the true underlying structure of the world, whether in a bird's wing, a swirling eddy of water, or the corner of a smiling mouth, would eventually reveal itself to him. Let that patient, endless looking settle over you now. There is no need to finish anything tonight either. Somewhere in an old notebook, a river continues to swirl in soft brown ink, waiting unhurried, for eyes that may never come to study it again, content simply to have been observed once, carefully, by candlelight. While Florence had spent much of the 15th century building its reputation as the intellectual and artistic capital of the new learning, Rome, for much of that same period, remained a comparatively modest and even somewhat shabby city, its ancient monuments crumbling and half-buried, its population reduced from the roughly 1 million inhabitants of the ancient imperial capital to perhaps 30 or 40,000 people scattered among cattle pastures and vegetable gardens that had grown up amid the ruins of the Forum. For much of the 14th century, the situation had been even worse, as the papacy itself had relocated to Avignon in southern France for nearly 70 years, and a subsequent schism had seen rival popes claiming authority from different cities at once, leaving Rome politically unstable and economically depressed. By the middle of the 15th century, however, with the papacy firmly re-established in Rome and the schism healed, a series of popes began to see in their city's ancient ruins and its position as the seat of Christendom an opportunity to rebuild Rome into a capital worthy of both its imperial past and its spiritual authority. This transformation would take decades, and it would draw upon exactly the same reservoir of humanist scholarship, artistic talent, and architectural ambition that had already flowered in Florence, as popes began actively recruiting Florentine and other artists to come work in Rome, offering commissions on a scale that even wealthy Florentine patrons found difficult to match. Pope Nicholas V, who reigned in the middle of the 15th century, is often credited with articulating the vision that would guide papal patronage for the following century. The idea that grand, beautiful architecture and art could serve the Church's spiritual mission by inspiring awe and reverence in ordinary believers, giving physical, visible form to the majesty of the faith. Nicholas began collecting manuscripts on an enormous scale, and his personal library would eventually form the core of the Vatican Library, one of the great repositories of ancient and medieval learning in the world. He also began, though only in a preliminary way, to consider rebuilding the ancient and by then quite dilapidated Basilica of St. Peter, a project that would not reach fruition for well over a century and would eventually involve nearly every major architect of the High Renaissance. It was under later popes, however, particularly Pope Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, that Rome's transformation truly accelerated into the frenzy of artistic activity that we now associate with the High Renaissance. Julius was a forceful, even bellicose figure, as comfortable leading armies in person to expand and defend papal territories as he was commissioning art, and he possessed an ambition for Rome's physical and cultural grandeur that matched his political ambitions for the papacy itself. It was Julius who made the momentous decision in 1506 to demolish the ancient and by then structurally unstable Basilica of St. Peter, the 4th-century church built over the traditional site of the Apostle Peter's burial, and to replace it with an entirely new basilica on a scale that would surpass anything built since antiquity. The architect chosen for this project was Donato Bramante, a Milanese-trained architect who had already, before coming to Rome, absorbed and extended many of the same principles of classical proportion and harmony that Brunelleschi had pioneered in Florence decades earlier. Bramante's design for the new St. Peter's called for an enormous central dome, larger even than Brunelleschi's Florence dome, rising above a floor plan in the shape of a Greek cross, evoking both the grandeur of ancient Roman buildings like the Pantheon and a renewed humanist sense of geometric perfection and balance. Bramante would not live to see his design realized. The project would be redesigned and modified by a succession of later architects over the following century, including, eventually, Michelangelo, who would take over the project late in his own life and design much of the dome that stands today. But Bramante's initial vision established the essential scale and ambition of the entire undertaking. Julius also commissioned, from the same architect, a beautifully proportioned small circular temple known as the Tempietto, built on the supposed site of St. Peter's martyrdom, a building so perfectly calibrated in its classical proportions, its columns and dome echoing ancient Roman temple architecture with such precision and grace, that it is often cited as one of the purest expressions of high Renaissance architectural ideals, a building that later architects across Europe would study and imitate for generations. But it was in the visual arts, even more than architecture, that Julius's patronage would produce some of the most celebrated works in the entire history of art, and it is to two of those commissions, one given to a sculptor summoned reluctantly to paint a ceiling, and another given to a young painter whose gentle grace would come to embody an entire aesthetic ideal, that we will turn in the chapters ahead. For now, though, let us simply rest in the image of this reawakening city. Scaffolding rising above ancient ruins, quarries of marble being cut and shipped down the Tiber, popes and cardinals walking through streets still half buried in the rubble of empire, all of it slowly, patiently, being cleared away and rebuilt into something that would carry Rome's ancient glory forward into an entirely new age. Breathe slowly here. The dust of centuries is settling around new foundations. There is nothing urgent in any of this. Rome had waited 1,000 years to be rebuilt. It could certainly wait a little longer, one careful stone at a time. Among all the artists summoned to Rome by Pope Julius II, none arrived with more reluctance, or would leave a more staggering legacy, than Michelangelo Buonarroti. Born in 1475 in a small Tuscan town, Michelangelo had been apprenticed as a young teenager to the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio in Florence, though he quickly gravitated toward sculpture, eventually studying in the household of Lorenzo de' Medici himself, where he had access to the Medici family's collection of ancient statuary and, according to tradition, received guidance from Bertoldo di Giovanni, an aging sculptor who had once studied under Donatello. From these earliest years, Michelangelo displayed a preoccupation that would define his entire career, an almost obsessive devotion to the human body, particularly the male nude, as the ultimate vehicle for expressing emotion, spiritual struggle, and physical beauty. By his mid-20s, Michelangelo had already produced 2 sculptures that established him as one of the preeminent artists of his generation. In Rome, in the late 1490s, he carved a marble Pieta for a French cardinal, depicting the Virgin Mary cradling the dead body of Christ across her lap, a subject that had been treated many times before in Northern European art but rarely with such tender, sorrowful naturalism, the folds of Mary's robe cascading in astonishingly lifelike marble drapery, her youthful face, deliberately youthful, Michelangelo explained, to represent the purity and incorruptibility of her soul, bowed in quiet, restrained grief rather than theatrical anguish. It remains, to this day, housed in St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most beloved sculptures in the Christian world. Returning to Florence shortly afterward, Michelangelo undertook an even more audacious project, carving a colossal marble statue of the biblical David from a single, enormous block of marble that had sat unused and considered flawed for decades after an earlier sculptor had abandoned work on it. Over roughly 3 years, working largely alone, Michelangelo transformed this rejected block into a towering 17-foot figure of the young shepherd, depicted not in the moment of triumph after slaying Goliath, as earlier artists including Donatello had chosen to show him, but in the tense, coiled moment just before the confrontation, his brow furrowed in concentration, his sling draped casually but purposefully over one shoulder, every muscle in his powerful, idealized body suggesting contained, waiting energy rather than relaxed victory. When the statue was unveiled in 1504, a committee of Florence's leading artists, including Leonardo da Vinci, was convened to decide where it should be placed, and it was eventually installed outside the city's town hall, the Palazzo della Signoria, as a civic symbol of Florentine liberty and resolve, a small republic's defiant readiness to face down more powerful enemies. It was this reputation as the finest sculptor of his generation that led Pope Julius II to summon Michelangelo to Rome in 1505, initially to design and carve an enormous marble tomb for the Pope himself, a project of staggering original ambition involving dozens of freestanding sculptural figures arranged across multiple levels. This tomb project, however, would become a source of decades of frustration for Michelangelo, repeatedly interrupted, redesigned, and scaled back over the following 40 years due to changing papal priorities and insufficient funding, eventually completed in a much reduced form long after Julius's death, though it did produce, among its surviving elements, the extraordinary marble statue of Moses, seated with a powerful, almost wrathful intensity, his beard cascading in tightly carved waves. That remains one of Michelangelo's most admired individual works. Far more consequential for art history, however, was a project Michelangelo initially resisted with considerable bitterness. In 1508, Julius commanded him to abandon work on the tomb, at least temporarily, and instead paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the Pope's private chapel within the Vatican Palace. Michelangelo protested that he was a sculptor, not a painter, and suspected, with some justification, that rival artists in the papal court were maneuvering to set him up for public failure in a medium they knew he had far less experience with. Nevertheless, he accepted the commission, and over the course of roughly 4 exhausting years, working largely alone or with only minimal assistance, much of the time lying and craning backward on custom-built scaffolding of his own design, he produced one of the most astonishing achievements in the entire history of painting. The Sistine Chapel ceiling covers an enormous curved surface with an intricate program of biblical scenes, beginning with the creation of the world and proceeding through the story of Adam and Eve, Noah, and the flood, framed by an elaborate painted architecture of niches and pilasters populated by monumental figures of prophets and sibyls, ancient pagan oracles whom Renaissance theology had come to interpret as unwitting forerunners of Christian revelation. At the very center of the ceiling's narrative sequence sits the panel that has become perhaps the single most reproduced image in the history of Western art, the creation of Adam, in which God, born through the heavens on a swirling cloud of drapery and attendant angels, reaches out one finger toward the languid, reclining figure of the newly formed Adam, the 2 fingers separated by the barest, most electric gap of empty space, a composition of such simple, perfect, dramatic tension that it has come to symbolize, almost by itself, the entire concept of divine creation and human potential that animated so much Renaissance thought. Michelangelo's figures throughout the ceiling, whether the muscular, twisting bodies of the ignudi, the idealized nude youths who populate the architectural framework, or the monumental, almost sculptural forms of the prophets and sibyls, reveal his fundamentally sculptural approach to painting. Every figure seems carved rather than merely painted. Every muscle and tendon rendered with an anatomical precision and dramatic exaggeration that transforms the flat ceiling into something that seems to bulge and strain with 3-dimensional physical force. Contemporary accounts describe the physical toll this work took on Michelangelo's own body. Years of looking upward while painting left him. By his own account, in a bitterly humorous sonnet he wrote about the experience, with his neck and spine so distorted that for some time afterward he could only read a letter by holding it above his head. When the ceiling was finally unveiled in 1512, it caused an immediate sensation, and Michelangelo's reputation as not merely a great sculptor but one of history's greatest painters was permanently established. He would return to the Sistine Chapel more than 2 decades later, commissioned by a subsequent pope to paint an enormous fresco of the Last Judgment on the chapel's altar wall, a darker, more turbulent work reflecting both his own advancing age and the more troubled, uncertain religious climate of the 1530s, following the upheavals of the Protestant Reformation, which we will touch on gently later in our journey tonight. Michelangelo lived to the remarkable age of 88, continuing to work almost until the end of his life, eventually turning much of his attention in his final decades to architecture, including, as mentioned, taking over the design of St. Peter's Basilica's dome, which was substantially completed according to his design after his death, its silhouette still dominating the skyline of Rome today alongside, in spirit if not in scale, the dome that Brunelleschi had raised over Florence a century earlier. Across his extraordinarily long and productive career spanning sculpture, painting, architecture, and even poetry, Michelangelo pursued, with an intensity that sometimes bordered on anguish, a singular artistic vision. The conviction that the human body, rendered with sufficient truth, power, and idealized beauty, could serve as the ultimate vessel for expressing the deepest struggles and aspirations of the human soul. Let your neck relax now, unlike his. There is no ceiling to paint tonight, no scaffolding to climb. Just the soft dark space above you, and somewhere in it, if you care to imagine it, two fingers reaching toward each other very slowly, never quite touching, needing never to touch, the meaning already complete in the reaching itself. If Michelangelo's art embodies struggle, tension, and raw physical power, the art of his younger contemporary Raphael embodies something almost entirely opposite. Grace, harmony, and an effortless, serene sense of balance that made him, during his own lifetime and for centuries afterward, perhaps the most universally beloved painter of the entire Renaissance. Raffaello Sanzio, born in 1483 in the small but culturally sophisticated city of Urbino, was the son of a court painter, and he seems to have absorbed the fundamentals of his craft with unusual speed and grace even as a child. He trained in his youth in the workshop of Pietro Perugino, one of the leading painters of central Italy, whose gentle, symmetrical compositions and soft, luminous coloring would leave a permanent imprint on Raphael's own developing style. By his early 20s, having spent time working in Florence, where he studied intensively the innovations of both Leonardo and Michelangelo, absorbing Leonardo's soft sfumato modeling and psychological subtlety on one hand and Michelangelo's monumental, sculptural sense of the human form on the other, Raphael had synthesized these influences into a style distinctly his own, warm, harmonious, deeply humane, populated by figures of idealized beauty who nonetheless seemed to possess genuine warmth and gentle, emotional presence. It was this reputation that led Pope Julius II to summon Raphael to Rome in 1508, the same year Michelangelo began work on the Sistine ceiling, to decorate a suite of papal apartments known as the stands, intended for Julius's own private use within the Vatican Palace. In the first and most celebrated of these rooms, now known as the Stanza della Signatura, Raphael painted a series of frescoes representing the different branches of human knowledge and endeavor as understood by Renaissance humanist thought. Theology, represented by a fresco known as the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament. Poetry, represented by a fresco depicting Mount Parnassus and the ancient muses alongside great poets of antiquity and Raphael's own era. And on the wall facing the Disputation, philosophy, represented by the fresco that has become perhaps the single most famous visual summary of Renaissance humanist thought ever created. The School of Athens. The School of Athens depicts an enormous, imagined gathering of ancient Greek philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians, assembled beneath a vast, coffered architectural space clearly inspired by Bramante's contemporary designs for the new St. Peter's Basilica, itself under construction just steps away from where Raphael was painting. At the composition center, walking together beneath the soaring arches, are Plato and Aristotle, rendered with careful symbolic precision. Plato, gesturing upward toward the heavens, holding a copy of his dialogue Timaeus, representing his philosophy's emphasis on transcendent, ideal forms beyond the physical world. Aristotle beside him, his hand extended flat and parallel to the ground, holding a copy of his Ethics, representing his contrasting philosophical emphasis on empirical observation and worldly, practical wisdom. Around this central pair, Raphael arranged dozens of other figures drawn from the history of ancient philosophy and science. Pythagoras absorbed in calculations on a slate, Euclid demonstrating a geometric proof with a compass, Diogenes sprawled with characteristic indifference across the marble steps, Heraclitus brooding alone in melancholy isolation. What makes the painting especially fascinating to later viewers is Raphael's decision to model several of these ancient figures on the faces of contemporary artists he knew and admired, a subtle but moving gesture that collapses the distance between ancient wisdom and the living creative community Raphael was himself part of. The brooding figure of Heraclitus, added relatively late in the painting's execution after Raphael had reportedly glimpsed Michelangelo's still unfinished Sistine ceiling, is widely believed to be modeled on Michelangelo's own features, rendered in a pose and coloring that also seems to pay tribute to Michelangelo's distinctive sculptural painting style. Plato's face, meanwhile, is generally thought to bear the features of Leonardo da Vinci, while Raphael himself appears among the crowd of figures on the painting's right side, looking directly out at the viewer, a quiet self-portrait signature nestled among the ancient philosophers he so evidently revered. The school of Athens represents, as clearly as any single work of art from the entire Renaissance, the fundamental intellectual project that had animated the movement since Petrarch first began collecting Cicero's letters nearly 2 centuries earlier. The conviction that the wisdom of the ancient world, far from being incompatible with contemporary Christian civilization, could be honored, studied, and even physically depicted within the very heart of the papal palace, standing as a kind of visual companion piece to the adjacent fresco celebrating Christian theology. Reason and revelation, ancient philosophy and Christian faith, were presented not as rivals but as complementary paths toward the same ultimate truth, a synthesis that captures the confident, optimistic intellectual spirit of the High Renaissance at perhaps its very peak. Raphael went on to enjoy an extraordinarily successful career in Rome over the following decade, running a large and highly organized workshop that produced an enormous quantity of paintings, tapestry designs, and architectural work, eventually being appointed the chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica following Bramante's death in 1514, alongside his ongoing work as a painter. He was renowned during his lifetime not only for his artistic gifts but for his personal charm and graciousness, a temperament quite different from the more famously difficult and solitary personalities of both Leonardo and Michelangelo, and this warmth seems to have made him beloved among the wide circle of patrons, fellow artists, and cardinals with whom he worked. Raphael's life, however, was tragically short. He died suddenly in 1520, on his 37th birthday, after a brief illness, an early death that shocked Rome and was mourned, according to contemporary accounts, with extraordinary public grief. His body was laid in state beneath his final, unfinished painting, The Transfiguration, and he was buried, at his own request, in the ancient Pantheon, that great surviving monument of Roman antiquity whose dome had so inspired Brunelleschi a century before, a fitting resting place for an artist, whose entire career had been devoted to reconciling the glories of the ancient past with the living art of his own age. Rest now beneath that great painted archway, if you like, among the gathered philosophers, none of them arguing, none of them raising their voices, each one simply absorbed, quietly and completely, in their own patient search for understanding. There is room enough for you there too, somewhere near the edge of the crowd, unnoticed and unhurried, listening to a conversation that has been going on calmly for 2,500 years and will go on calmly for a great many more. Let us leave the hills of Tuscany and the 7 hills of Rome for a while, and drift instead toward water, toward a city unlike any other in Italy or indeed in the world. Venice, built not upon solid ground but upon a cluster of small islands scattered across a shallow lagoon on the Adriatic coast, its streets replaced by canals, its carriages replaced by boats, its very foundations driven, piling upon piling, into the soft mud beneath the water. Venice's peculiar geography shaped everything about its character and its history. Founded, according to tradition, by refugees fleeing barbarian invasions on the Italian mainland in the 5th and 6th centuries, the city grew over the following centuries into one of the most powerful maritime and commercial republics in the entire Mediterranean world, its ships carrying spices, silk, and other luxury goods between the Eastern Mediterranean, the Islamic world, Byzantium, and the markets of Western Europe. By the height of its power, in the 14th and 15th centuries, Venice controlled not only its home lagoon but a substantial maritime empire stretching down the Adriatic coast and across numerous Greek islands, along with significant territories on the Italian mainland, making it one of the wealthiest and most formidable states in Europe. Unlike Florence, which was governed, at least in principle, by a fairly broad citizen body, and unlike Rome, governed by the Pope, Venice was ruled by a hereditary aristocracy of merchant families, whose names were recorded in a document known as the Golden Book, and who alone were eligible to sit in the city's great council and to hold the highest offices of state, including that of the Doge, the elected head of the Republic who served, in ceremonial terms, almost as a kind of Venetian monarch, though his actual powers were carefully constrained by an elaborate system of councils and committees designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much personal authority. This system, sometimes called the myth of Venice by later historians because Venetians themselves worked so hard to present it as a model of stable, harmonious, divinely favored government, did in fact produce a degree of political stability that was the envy of much of the rest of Italy, a republic that endured, with only gradual and incremental change, for over 1,000 years, from its early medieval founding until its eventual conquest by Napoleon at the very end of the 18th century. This stability, combined with Venice's enormous mercantile wealth and its unique position as a crossroads between Western Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean world, created ideal conditions for a flourishing of art and culture that, while sharing many of the same humanist and classical influences that had shaped Florence and Rome, developed its own distinctive character, shaped above all by the unique quality of Venetian light, reflected and multiplied by the surrounding water, and by the city's close commercial and cultural ties to Byzantium and the wider Eastern Mediterranean. Venetian painting, in particular, developed a reputation, beginning in the late 15th century and reaching its full maturity in the 16th, for a use of color and light that many contemporaries considered unmatched anywhere else in Italy, where Florentine and Roman art, shaped by artists like Michelangelo, tended to emphasize disegno, meaning drawing or design, the careful sculptural definition of form through line and contour. Venetian art tended to emphasize color itself, applied in rich, luminous layers that built up form and atmosphere through the interaction of hue and light rather than through crisp outline. This distinction, though somewhat overstated by later critics eager to characterize regional rivalries, nonetheless captures something real about the differing sensibilities that developed in these two great artistic centers. The painter most associated with the birth of this distinctive Venetian style was Giovanni Bellini, whose long career, stretching from the middle of the 15th century into the early 16th, produced luminous, tender depictions of the Madonna and Infant Christ set against soft, atmospheric landscapes rendered with a delicate attention to natural light that profoundly influenced a generation of younger Venetian painters, including his own students. One of these students, a young painter usually known by the nickname Giorgione, though he died tragically young, probably of plague, in 1510, before turning 35, produced a small number of enigmatic, deeply poetic paintings, including a work known as The Tempest, depicting a mysterious, unexplained scene of a soldier and a nursing woman beneath a stormy, lightning-streaked sky that seemed to prioritize mood, atmosphere, and poetic suggestion over any clear narrative content, a quality that would become increasingly important in later Venetian art. It was another student of Bellini's circle, however, who would come to dominate Venetian painting for most of the 16th century and achieve a level of European-wide fame that rivaled or exceeded that of any painter working in Florence or Rome. Tiziano Vecellio, known to English speakers as Titian. Over an extraordinarily long career, spanning roughly 7 decades, Titian produced an enormous body of work encompassing religious altarpieces, mythological scenes drawn from ancient poetry, and above all, portraits of such psychological penetration and technical brilliance that he became the preferred portraitist of popes, kings, and emperors across Europe, including the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who reportedly once stooped to pick up a paintbrush that Titian had dropped, remarking that it was fitting for an emperor to serve so great an artist. Titian's handling of paint itself evolved dramatically over his long career, moving from the relatively smooth, carefully blended surfaces of his earlier work toward an increasingly free, visible, almost impressionistic brushwork in his final decades, built up through many successive layers and glazes of color applied, according to contemporary accounts, sometimes with his fingers rather than a brush, achieving effects of atmospheric shimmer and glowing, jewel-like color that would profoundly influence generations of later European painters, from Rubens to Rembrandt to the Impressionists of the 19th century. Venice's contribution to the Renaissance extended well beyond painting. The city became, by the late 15th century, one of the most important centers of printing and publishing in all of Europe, home to the workshop of Aldus Manutius, whose innovative small, portable editions of classical Greek and Latin texts, printed in an elegant new typeface and sold at prices accessible to a much wider readership than the enormous, expensive folio volumes typical of earlier printing, helped democratize access to classical learning in ways that Petrarch, laboriously copying manuscripts by hand a century and a half earlier, could scarcely have imagined. We will return to this revolution in printing shortly, because its consequences extend far beyond Venice, reshaping the transmission of ideas across the entire European continent. For now, though, let us simply rest on the water. Picture a gondola moving slowly along a quiet canal in the late evening, the sound of its oar dipping and lifting the only noise beside distant, muffled voices and the gentle lapping of water against old stone foundations. Somewhere nearby, in a workshop lit by oil lamp, a painter is layering the last translucent glaze of color onto a canvas that will still be glowing, warm, and luminous 5 centuries from now. The lagoon holds its breath around the city, patient, still, reflecting back 1,000 small lights. Of all the developments that shaped the Renaissance and its aftermath, none had consequences more far-reaching, more difficult to overstate, than a mechanical invention perfected around the middle of the 15th century in the German city of Mainz, far from the sunlit courtyards of Florence. The printing press with movable metal type, developed by a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg. Before Gutenberg's innovation, every book in Europe had to be copied by hand, a slow, laborious, and expensive process that limited the total number of books in existence and kept literacy and access to written knowledge confined largely to clergy, nobility, and a relatively narrow class of wealthy merchants and professionals. A single manuscript Bible might take a skilled scribe the better part of a year to complete, and the resulting volume, given the cost of parchment or vellum, the scribe's labor, and often elaborate hand-painted illumination, might be worth more than a small house. Even the humanist scholars we have already discussed tonight, hunting through monastery libraries for lost classical texts, were dependent on this same slow manual system for creating and circulating copies of whatever treasures they found. Gutenberg's innovation combined several existing technologies in a genuinely novel way. He developed a method for casting individual metal letters, quickly and in large quantities, using a reusable mold, allowing a printer to assemble any combination of words by arranging these individual letter blocks into a frame. He adapted the mechanical screw press technology already used in wine and olive oil production to create even, consistent pressure for transferring ink from the assembled type onto paper. And he developed an oil-based ink formulated specifically to adhere properly to metal type, rather than the water-based inks traditionally used by scribes, which would not have worked well with the new printing process. Around 1450, Gutenberg began printing what would become his most famous production, a beautifully typeset edition of the Latin Bible, completed around 1455, of which perhaps 40 or 50 copies survive today, each one a monument to the extraordinary care and craftsmanship Gutenberg brought to this new technology even in its infancy. The printed letters so carefully designed and evenly spaced that early readers sometimes mistook printed Bibles for exceptionally fine handwritten manuscripts. The consequences of this invention unfolded with a speed that must have astonished even Gutenberg himself, had he lived to see the full scope of what he had set in motion. Printing technology spread rapidly across Europe in the following decades, with printing workshops established in Italy, France, the Low Countries, and England within roughly 20 years of Gutenberg's first Bible. The city of Venice, as we have just discussed, became one of the most important printing centers on the entire continent, and it has been estimated that by the year 1500, less than half a century after Gutenberg's Bible, European presses had produced somewhere between 8 and 20 million printed books, a staggering increase in the total volume of written material in circulation compared to everything that had been laboriously hand-copied in all the preceding centuries combined. This explosion in the availability of books had consequences that touched nearly every aspect of the intellectual and cultural transformation we have been tracing tonight. The classical texts that scholars like Petrarch and Poggio Bracciolini had painstakingly rediscovered and hand-copied could now be printed in the hundreds or thousands, spreading humanist learning far beyond the small circles of wealthy patrons and dedicated scholars who had previously been the only people with access to such rare manuscripts. Aldus Manutius's Venetian press, which we touched on in the previous chapter, specialized precisely in making high-quality, accurately edited editions of Greek and Latin classics available in relatively affordable portable formats, allowing university students and interested amateurs across Europe, not just the wealthiest patrons, to build personal libraries of ancient wisdom that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. Printing also transformed the pace and geography of intellectual exchange. New scientific and philosophical ideas could now spread across the continent within months or a few years rather than the decades or centuries it might previously have taken for a single hand-copied manuscript to circulate widely. Scholars in different cities and countries could read and respond to each other's published work with a speed and reach that fundamentally altered the nature of intellectual debate, creating something approaching a pan-European community of scholars corresponding, publishing, and arguing with one another across national and linguistic boundaries. The consequences extended well beyond the world of classical scholarship. Printing would soon prove instrumental in the spread of the Protestant Reformation, which erupted in Germany in 1517 when a monk and theology professor named Martin Luther published his 95 Theses criticizing certain practices of the Catholic Church, particularly the sale of indulgences. Luther's writings, along with his translation of the Bible into vernacular German, were printed and distributed across German-speaking lands with a speed that would have been utterly impossible in the age of hand-copied manuscripts, allowing his ideas to spread and take root among ordinary literate people before church authorities could effectively suppress them. The Reformation, and the century of religious upheaval and conflict that followed it across Europe, is far too large and turbulent a subject for our calm, unhurried journey tonight, but it is worth noting, gently, in passing, just how deeply the printing press, born from the same broader Renaissance spirit of technical innovation and the recovery of learning, would go on to reshape the religious and political landscape of the entire continent. Printing also gradually expanded literacy itself, as books became cheaper and more widely available, creating economic incentive for a broader portion of the population, including many outside the traditional clerical and noble classes, to learn to read. Vernacular literature, written in everyday spoken languages like Italian, French, German, and English rather than scholarly Latin, found an increasingly large and eager readership, and the printing press made possible the wide circulation of everything from popular romances and devotional pamphlets to increasingly ambitious scientific treatises describing new observations of the natural world. It is worth pausing in this quiet hour to appreciate the strange, almost paradoxical nature of this transformation. A purely mechanical invention, metal type, a wine press adapted to a new purpose, a carefully formulated ink, became one of the single most consequential forces in the flowering of human thought and culture that we have been tracing tonight. The Renaissance is often remembered through its paintings and sculptures, through the individual genius of figures like Leonardo and Michelangelo, and rightly so. But it was equally, perhaps even more fundamentally, a revolution in how information itself moved through society, how quickly an idea conceived in one mind could reach and take root in 1,000 others, scattered across a whole continent, each one reading by their own candlelight, in their own quiet hour, the same words that a scholar or a monk or a printer had set, letter by careful letter, months or years before. Let the soft rhythmic clack of that old wooden press settle into the back of your mind now, slow and steady as a heartbeat, page after page after page, carrying quiet words out into a waiting world. For much of tonight's journey, we have remained within Italy, and this is appropriate since Italy, and above all Florence, Rome, and Venice, was where the distinctive combination of humanist scholarship, classical revival, and artistic innovation that we call the Renaissance first took clear and confident shape. But ideas, once set loose into the world, particularly once carried along the new printing routes we have just traced, rarely respect political borders, and by the final decades of the 15th century and throughout the 16th, the currents of Renaissance thought and artistic practice had begun flowing steadily northward, across the Alps, into France, the Low Countries, and the German-speaking lands, where they combined with existing local traditions to produce their own remarkable flowering, often called by later historians, the Northern Renaissance. It would be a mistake, though, to think of the Northern Renaissance simply as a delayed or lesser copy of events in Italy. Northern Europe had its own rich artistic traditions stretching back well before Italian humanism began its ascent, and in certain respects, particularly in the technical mastery of oil painting, Northern artists were arguably ahead of their Italian counterparts for much of the 15th century. The Flemish painter Jan van Eyck, working in the city of Bruges in the 1420s and 1430s, achieved a level of minute, jewel-like detail and luminous realism in his oil paintings that astonished Italian visitors who saw his work, particularly his ability to render the precise, individual sparkle of light on metal, glass, and fabric with a clarity that seemed almost magical. His famous double portrait of the merchant Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, painted in 1434, packs an entire small universe of carefully observed detail into a single domestic interior, from the individual bristles of a small dog's fur to the tiny, convex mirror on the back wall that reflects, in miniature, the entire room and two additional figures standing in the doorway, presumably including the painter himself. This tradition of minutely observed, technically masterful oil painting continued to develop across the Low Countries throughout the 15th century, in the work of painters like Rogier van der Weyden and Hans Memling, whose devotional paintings combined intense emotional expressiveness with the same jewel-like precision of detail that Van Eyck had pioneered. It was this rich, already sophisticated Northern tradition that gradually began to encounter and absorb the humanist scholarship and classical artistic theory flowing outward from Italy, producing, particularly in the German lands, a generation of artists who successfully fused Northern technical precision with Italian humanist learning and classical form. The clearest example of this fusion is the German artist Albrecht Dürer, born in Nuremberg in 1471, who traveled twice to Italy, in the 1490s and again in 1505 to 1507, specifically to study Italian art and, crucially, Italian art theory, including the mathematical principles of human proportion and perspective that Italian artists and theorists had been developing since Brunelleschi's era. Dürer became fascinated with the idea, central to Italian Renaissance thought, that ideal human beauty could be captured through careful mathematical proportion, and he spent years of his life researching and eventually publishing his own treatises on human proportion and geometry, applying a characteristically northern, almost scientific thoroughness to questions that Italian artists had often approached more intuitively. Dürer was also one of the first major fine artists to fully grasp and exploit the artistic potential of the printing press, not merely for reproducing images cheaply but as a serious artistic medium in its own right. His woodcuts and engravings, produced in editions that could be sold across Europe at prices far below the cost of a commissioned painting, spread his reputation and his distinctive style more widely and more quickly than almost any painter of his generation could achieve through painted works alone. His engraving known as Melancholia I, produced in 1514, depicting a brooding, winged allegorical figure surrounded by scientific and mathematical instruments left seemingly abandoned in a moment of creative frustration, remains one of the most analyzed and debated images in the history of printmaking, understood by most scholars as a meditation on the melancholy that Renaissance thinkers associated with genius, creativity, and the frustrating gap between human ambition and human limitation. Alongside this flowering of northern visual art, the same decade saw the emergence of a distinctly northern strand of humanist scholarship, epitomized above all by the Dutch scholar Desiderius Erasmus, whose extraordinarily wide correspondence and prolific published writings made him, by the early 16th century, arguably the most famous and influential intellectual figure in all of Europe. Erasmus applied the philological and textual methods that Italian humanists had developed for studying classical Latin and Greek literature to the texts of Christian scripture and the early Church Fathers, producing, among much else, a carefully edited New Greek edition of the New Testament, published in 1516, that highlighted, through careful textual comparison, numerous places where the standard Latin translation used by the Church for over 1,000 years appeared to diverge from the meaning of the original Greek text. Erasmus combined this serious scholarly project with a gift for witty, satirical writing that made his work accessible and entertaining to a far broader readership than most scholarly Latin treatises of the era achieved. His work in praise of folly, written in 1509 and published shortly afterward, presents a mock oration delivered by the personified figure of Folly herself, who praises, with elaborate and increasingly biting irony, the foolishness she finds at every level of society, from ordinary superstitious peasants to corrupt, worldly clergy and theologians more interested in hair-splitting logical disputes than genuine Christian charity. The work was enormously popular across Europe and helped establish a broader climate of critical, sometimes satirical re-examination of religious institutions and practices that would form part of the intellectual backdrop to the Reformation that erupted just a few years later, even though Erasmus himself, unlike Luther, remained within the Catholic Church throughout his life and grew increasingly uncomfortable with the more radical and divisive turns the Reformation eventually took. This period also saw significant developments in France, where King Francis I, whom we have already met inviting the aging Leonardo da Vinci to spend his final years at Amboise, actively promoted Italian Renaissance art and learning at the French royal court, inviting numerous Italian artists and craftsmen to work on ambitious building projects like the chateaux of the Loire Valley, which blend traditional French architectural forms with newly imported Italian classical ornament and proportion, and founding what would eventually become the Collège de France, an institution dedicated to teaching Greek, Hebrew, and other humanist subjects outside the more conservative, theologically focused curriculum of the traditional University of Paris. By the middle decades of the 16th century, then, the essential intellectual and artistic currents of the Renaissance, born from Petrarch's rediscovered manuscripts and matured through generations of Florentine, Roman, and Venetian patronage, had spread across the entire European continent, absorbed and transformed by local traditions in the Low Countries, Germany, France, and beyond, creating a genuinely pan-European movement of humanist learning and artistic innovation whose full consequences would continue to unfold in art, in science, in religion, and in political thought for centuries to come. Let this wider map settle gently in your mind now, not just the hills of Tuscany, but the flat, canal-crossed fields of Flanders, the timbered towns of the Rhineland, the slow, wide rivers of the Loire Valley, each one catching, in its own particular light, a small reflected glow of the same distant Florentine dawn. Much of the story we have followed tonight has, inevitably, centered on men. The merchant bankers, the humanist scholars, the sculptors and painters and popes whose names fill the history books and whose works still hang in the world's great museums. This reflects a genuine historical reality. The formal structures of power, patronage, education, and guild membership that shaped Renaissance artistic and intellectual life were overwhelmingly controlled by men, and women faced substantial, often formal legal and institutional barriers to participating in these fields on equal terms. And yet, within and sometimes against these constraints, a number of remarkable women found ways to contribute to the intellectual and artistic flowering of the age, and their stories, though often quieter and less thoroughly documented than those of their male contemporaries, deserve a gentle place in our unhurried journey tonight. Isabella d'Este, born in 1474 into the ruling family of Ferrara and later married into the ruling family of Mantua, became one of the most sophisticated and influential art patrons of the entire Renaissance, assembling, over several decades, one of the most celebrated art collections and libraries in Italy, and corresponding directly and often quite assertively with major artists of her era, including Leonardo da Vinci, whom she pursued for years, with only partial success, to complete a portrait she had commissioned. Isabella created within her apartments in the Ducal Palace of Mantua a private study and retreat known as her studiolo, decorated with an intricate allegorical painting program that she personally devised, drawing on classical mythology to construct sophisticated visual meditations on virtue, wisdom, and the harmony of the arts. Her correspondence, much of which survives, reveals a shrewd, demanding, and highly knowledgeable patron who negotiated directly and often quite forcefully with the leading artists of her day over questions of subject matter, price, and delivery schedules, functioning, in effect, as a genuine creative collaborator in the works she commissioned rather than merely a passive purchaser. In the world of literature and scholarship, a number of women succeeded, often against considerable social resistance, in establishing genuine reputations as humanist writers and thinkers. Vittoria Colonna, born into a powerful Roman noble family in 1490 and widowed relatively young, became one of the most respected poets of her generation. Her sonnets, many of them reflecting on grief, faith, and spiritual devotion following her husband's death, widely admired and circulated among the leading literary figures of the day. Colonna also developed a close, evidently deeply meaningful friendship with the elderly Michelangelo, who wrote poems addressed to her and, according to surviving accounts, gave her several small drawings as gifts, their relationship apparently combining intellectual companionship, shared religious sensibility, and mutual artistic respect in a way that clearly meant a great deal to the aging sculptor during a period of considerable personal introspection. In the visual arts specifically, women faced particularly severe institutional obstacles, since the guild system that governed most artistic training and professional practice in Italian cities generally excluded women from formal apprenticeships, and prevailing social conventions made it difficult or impossible for a woman to study the nude male body from life, a foundational element of the anatomical training that painters and sculptors of the era were expected to master. Despite these obstacles, a small number of women did succeed in establishing genuine painting careers, typically by training within the household workshop of a father or other male relative who was himself a professional painter. Sofonisba Anguissola, born around 1532 into a noble but not especially wealthy family in Cremona, received unusually thorough artistic training arranged by her father, who recognized and actively cultivated his daughter's talent, and she went on to achieve genuine international fame as a portraitist, eventually being invited to the Spanish royal court, where she served for years as a lady-in-waiting and court painter to the queen, producing portraits notable for their psychological subtlety and, in several of her earlier self-portraits and family portraits, an unusually warm, informal intimacy quite different from the more stiffly formal court portraiture typical of the era. It is worth remembering, too, that the humanist educational curriculum we discussed earlier in our journey, though designed and taught primarily by and for men, was not entirely closed to women of sufficiently wealthy and progressive families. Isata Nagarola, born in Verona in 1418, received a genuine humanist education alongside her sisters and went on to conduct sophisticated Latin correspondence with leading male scholars of her era on questions of classical literature and theology, eventually withdrawing from public intellectual life. as many learned women of the era felt compelled to do in the face of social suspicion directed at women who pursued scholarly reputation, to live a more retired, contemplative life devoted to religious and philosophical writing. Laura Sarita, born in Brescia in 1469, similarly received a strong humanist education and produced a substantial body of Latin letters and essays defending women's intellectual capacities and criticizing what she saw as the unjust social constraints placed on educated women of her time, arguing, in language that feels startlingly direct even across more than 5 centuries, that women's apparent intellectual inferiority was a product of denied education and social discouragement rather than any inherent natural limitation. These stories, taken together, remind us of something important as we drift through this history tonight, that the great flowering of art and learning we have been tracing was never quite as universally accessible as its most idealistic humanist proponents, with their soaring rhetoric about human dignity and boundless human potential, sometimes suggested. Pico della Mirandola's vision of humanity free to shape itself into whatever form it chose was, in practice, a vision realized far more fully for men of wealth and status than for women, however gifted, who continued to navigate a world of formal and informal barriers throughout the period. And yet, within and sometimes in direct, articulate opposition to those barriers, women like Isabella d'Este, Vittoria Colonna, Sophonisba Anguissola, and Laura Sarita found ways to think, to create, to patronize, and to argue their way into the historical record, leaving behind letters, poems, paintings, and collections that continue to enrich our understanding of just how wide and varied the true landscape of Renaissance culture actually was. Let their quieter voices settle now alongside all the grander, more famous ones we have already heard tonight. A poem written in grief by candlelight. A shrewd letter negotiating a painter's fee. A portrait of a sister, painted by a sister, hung for centuries in rooms that history mostly forgot to record. All of it part of the same slow, patient dawn. Woven through everything we have traced tonight, the recovery of ancient texts, the mathematical precision of linear perspective, Leonardo's endless anatomical notebooks, runs a single deeper thread that deserves its own quiet attention before our journey draws toward its close, a gradually shifting relationship between human beings and the natural world, in which careful, direct observation began to take on an authority that had, for many centuries, belonged more exclusively to inherited tradition and ancient textual authority. For much of the medieval period, questions about the natural world, the movement of the planets, the composition of matter, the workings of the human body, had generally been approached primarily through the careful study and interpretation of ancient authorities, above all Aristotle for questions of natural philosophy and Galen for questions of medicine and anatomy, whose conclusions, transmitted and commented upon across many centuries, carried an authority that direct observation was not always considered sufficient to overturn. This is not to say that medieval scholars never observed nature directly, but the prevailing intellectual culture generally treated ancient textual authority as the primary and most trustworthy source of natural knowledge. The humanist recovery of ancient texts that we have traced throughout tonight's journey had a curious, somewhat paradoxical effect on this situation. On one hand, it initially reinforced reverence for ancient authority, as newly recovered and more accurately translated texts of Aristotle, Galen, and other ancient scientific writers were studied with renewed enthusiasm. But the same philological, critical methods that humanist scholars like Erasmus applied to biblical and classical texts, carefully comparing different manuscript versions, questioning traditional interpretations, insisting on returning to original sources rather than relying on centuries of accumulated commentary, gradually encouraged a broader intellectual habit of critical, independent examination that would eventually be turned toward nature itself, rather than only toward ancient texts. About nature. We have already seen this spirit at work in Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical studies, where his own careful, direct dissection of human cadavers led him to observe and record details of human anatomy that sometimes contradicted the received teachings of Galen, whose own anatomical descriptions, it later emerged, had been based largely on the dissection of animals rather than humans, since Roman law had generally prohibited human dissection during Galen's own lifetime. Leonardo's notebooks contain drawings of the human heart, the muscles of the arm, the structure of the spine, rendered with an accuracy that would not be matched in published anatomical illustration for well over a century, though because Leonardo never published these notebooks during his lifetime, their direct scientific influence on his contemporaries remained limited, a quiet, private triumph of observation that the wider world would not fully appreciate for a very long time. More publicly influential in the field of anatomy was the Flemish physician Andreas Vesalius, who studied and later taught anatomy at the University of Padua, one of the leading medical schools in Europe, and who conducted his own careful, systematic program of human dissection, insisting, in a break from established academic practice, on personally performing dissections himself in front of his students rather than merely reading aloud from ancient texts while a lower-status assistant handled the actual cutting. In 1543, Vesalius published an enormously detailed and beautifully illustrated anatomical textbook, based directly on his own observations, that corrected numerous long-standing errors inherited from Galen and established a new standard of anatomical accuracy based on direct human dissection rather than ancient textual authority, a landmark achievement in the history of medicine that exemplifies, as clearly as any single publication could, the broader Renaissance shift toward direct observation as a source of reliable knowledge. That same year, 1543, also saw the publication of another work whose consequences would prove even more far-reaching, though its author, the Polish astronomer and church canon Nicholas Copernicus, reportedly received his first printed copy only on his deathbed. Copernicus's book proposed, with careful mathematical argument, a heliocentric model of the universe, in which the Earth and other planets orbit around a stationary sun, in direct contradiction to the geocentric model, placing a stationary Earth at the center of the universe with the sun and planets orbiting around it, that had been the standard understanding since antiquity, associated above all with the ancient astronomer Ptolemy and generally considered consistent with both everyday observation and Christian scripture. Copernicus's heliocentric theory did not emerge from any single dramatic new observation, but rather from his conviction, developed over decades of careful study, that a sun-centered model could account for the observed movements of the planets with greater mathematical elegance and simplicity than the increasingly complicated system of adjustments and corrections that astronomers had layered onto the traditional Earth-centered model over many centuries in an effort to make it match observed planetary motion more precisely. It is worth noting that Copernicus himself remained cautious about publishing his theory during most of his lifetime, aware of both its radical implications and the resistance it was likely to encounter, and the book's actual impact unfolded only gradually over the following century, as later astronomers, most famously Galileo Galilei and Johannes Kepler, working in the early decades of the 17th century, provided additional observational evidence and mathematical refinement that eventually helped establish heliocentrism as the accepted scientific understanding of our solar system, a process that extended well beyond the traditional chronological boundaries of the Renaissance itself, but that had its essential intellectual roots firmly within the same climate of careful observation and willingness to question ancient authority that we have traced throughout tonight's journey. It would be an overstatement to claim that the Renaissance, by itself, single-handedly produced modern science, a development that unfolded over a much longer period and drew on many additional influences beyond the specific humanist and artistic movements we have focused on tonight. But it is fair to say that the Renaissance cultivated, across many different fields simultaneously, a particular set of intellectual habits and values: careful attention to direct observation, willingness to compare and critically evaluate different sources rather than simply deferring to inherited authority, confidence in human reason's capacity to understand and describe the natural world. That would prove essential to the scientific developments of the following centuries. Leonardo's careful sketches of turbulent water, Vesalius's insistence on performing his own dissections, Copernicus's patient mathematical calculations pursued in relative solitude over decades. Each represents, in its own particular field, that same quiet, patient, curious spirit that had first stirred, 2 centuries earlier, in Petrarch's excited discovery of Cicero's forgotten letters. Let your eyes drift upward now, if you like, toward an imagined night sky, calm and vast and utterly indifferent to the small human arguments that once raged about what, exactly, moved around what. The stars themselves never needed convincing. They simply continued, as they always had and always would, tracing their slow, patient courses through the dark, waiting, without any particular urgency, for someone eventually to look up and understand. No golden age, however genuinely golden, lasts forever, and no history is complete without acknowledging, gently and without undue alarm, the ways in which even the most remarkable flowering eventually gives way to change, to loss, and to the slow transformation into something new. The Italian Renaissance, for all its extraordinary achievements, unfolded against a backdrop of near-constant political instability, as the various city-states and principalities of Italy, wealthy and cultured as they were, remained militarily fragmented and vulnerable to the ambitions of larger, more centralized foreign powers, above all France and Spain, who spent much of the late 15th and early 16th centuries competing for dominance over the Italian peninsula in a prolonged and often devastating series of conflicts historians now call the Italian Wars. It was within this turbulent context that one of the most traumatic single events of the entire Renaissance period occurred, in May of 1527, when a poorly paid and increasingly mutinous army nominally serving the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, composed of a volatile mixture of Spanish and German troops, many of the latter sympathetic to the new Lutheran Protestant movement and harboring considerable hostility toward the Catholic papacy, marched on Rome itself and, after breaching the city's defenses, subjected it to weeks of horrific violence, looting, and destruction that came to be known as the Sack of Rome. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of almost unimaginable brutality: churches and monasteries pillaged and desecrated, ancient and Renaissance artworks destroyed or stolen, tens of thousands of Roman citizens killed, and Pope Clement VII himself forced to take refuge for months within the fortified walls of the Castel Sant'Angelo while his city burned and suffered around him. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves across the whole of Italy and indeed across Europe, and many contemporary observers and later historians have identified it as a symbolic turning point, an event that punctured the confident, optimistic humanist spirit of the High Renaissance and ushered in a more anxious, uncertain intellectual and artistic climate. Rome itself took decades to fully recover, both physically and psychologically, and the enormous, ambitious project of rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, among many other undertakings, was significantly delayed and disrupted by the financial and administrative chaos that followed the sack. This event unfolded, moreover, against the backdrop of the wider religious upheaval we have already touched on gently in earlier chapters, as Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority, launched a decade earlier in 1517, had by the 1520s developed into a full-scale religious schism dividing German-speaking Europe and soon spreading, in various forms, to Switzerland, France, England, and beyond. The Catholic Church's eventual response to this crisis, a broad program of internal reform and doctrinal clarification often called the Counter-Reformation, formally initiated at the Council of Trent, which met intermittently between 1545 and 1563, brought with it a more cautious, sometimes suspicious attitude towards certain aspects of Renaissance humanist culture, particularly its enthusiasm for pagan classical literature and its occasionally frank celebration of the nude human body in religious art, both of which came under increased scrutiny from church authorities anxious to reassert doctrinal discipline and moral seriousness in the face of Protestant criticism. Michelangelo himself experienced this shifting climate directly and personally. When his enormous fresco of the Last Judgment, painted on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel between 1536 and 1541, depicting a chaotic, muscular swirl of nude and semi-nude figures ascending toward heaven or plunging toward hell, was unveiled, it drew criticism from certain church figures who considered its abundant nudity inappropriate for so sacred a location, and following Michelangelo's own death in 1564, church authorities commissioned another painter to add draped loincloths over the most prominently exposed figures, a modification that survives, in modified form, to this day, standing as a small but telling physical reminder of just how significantly the cultural climate had shifted within a single artist's own long lifetime, from the confident, celebratory nudity of Donatello's bronze David a century earlier to the anxious, protective draping applied to Michelangelo's own masterpiece in its final years. It would be an oversimplification, however, to suggest that Renaissance art, learning, or culture simply ended abruptly with the sack of Rome or the Council of Trent. Artistic and intellectual life continued to flourish across Italy and the rest of Europe throughout the remainder of the 16th century and well beyond, though often taking on new forms and new emphases that art historians have come to describe using different names. Mannerism, in the visual arts, referring to a style, prominent especially in the middle and later 16th century, characterized by elongated, elegant, sometimes deliberately unnatural figures and complex, artificial compositions that seem to consciously depart from the balanced, harmonious naturalism of high Renaissance masters like Raphael, perhaps reflecting, in its own restless, sophisticated way, some of the anxiety and uncertainty of an age no longer quite so confident in the stable, harmonious order that earlier Renaissance thought had celebrated. Venice, notably, continued to flourish artistically for decades after Rome's traumatic sack, relatively insulated by its own political stability, continued commercial prosperity, and greater geographic distance from the immediate epicenters of the Italian wars, with Titian continuing to produce masterful work well into the 1570s, and younger Venetian painters like Tintoretto and Paolo Veronese producing enormous, dynamic, richly colored works throughout the second half of the 16th century. That carried forward and further developed the distinctive Venetian artistic tradition we explored earlier in our journey. And beyond Italy, as we have already seen, the broader currents of humanist learning, printing, and artistic innovation continued to spread and develop across Northern Europe throughout the 16th century and into the 17th, eventually contributing to intellectual and artistic developments. The scientific revolution associated with figures like Galileo and Kepler, the artistic achievements of later masters like Rubens and Rembrandt, the continued expansion of printing and literacy across the whole of European society, that extended the Renaissance's essential legacy of careful observation, classical learning, and confident human creative achievement forward across the following centuries, long after the specific historical moment we have spent tonight exploring had given way to new eras with new names and new preoccupations. So let this chapter of loss and transition settle gently rather than heavily. Every dawn eventually gives way to full daylight, and every daylight eventually softens, in its own turn, toward evening. What matters, perhaps, is not that any particular golden age lasts forever, but that it leaves behind, once it has passed, a legacy patient enough to be rediscovered and treasured by whatever ages come after it, the way Petrarch himself once rediscovered, in a dusty monastery library, wisdom that had waited patiently through centuries of neglect for someone willing to look closely enough to find it again. We have traveled a long way together tonight, from the wool markets and counting houses of 13th century Florence, through Petrarch's excited discovery of Cicero's forgotten letters, past the rising brick courses of Brunelleschi's impossible dome, through Medici libraries and Donatello's quiet Florentine courtyard, alongside Leonardo's endless, patient notebooks, beneath Michelangelo's straining, reaching ceiling, into Raphael's gathered philosophers, out onto the still, reflective canals of Venice, past the rhythmic clacking of Gutenberg's press, across the Alps into Flemish workshops and German print shops, alongside the quiet, determined voices of Isabella d'Este and Laura Sarita, up toward Copernicus's patient, stargazing calculations, and finally through the smoke and rubble of Rome's darkest single week, out the other side into whatever came next. It is worth asking, gently, in these final quiet moments, what exactly remains of all this, 5 centuries later, and why any of it should matter to you now, drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, wrapped in whatever blanket or darkness is holding you at this particular hour. Perhaps the honest answer is that the Renaissance's deepest legacy is not really contained in any single painting or building or text, however magnificent, but in a particular attitude toward human possibility that the era, at its best moments, articulated and modeled with unusual clarity and confidence. The conviction that human beings, through patient study, careful observation, and disciplined effort, are capable of recovering lost wisdom, of understanding the world more clearly than their ancestors did, of creating beauty and meaning that can genuinely outlast a single human lifetime. This conviction was never perfectly realized, and we have tried gently throughout tonight's journey not to pretend otherwise. It coexisted with plague, war, political violence, and deeply entrenched social exclusions that kept its benefits from reaching most of the population, including the vast majority of women and the poor. The same humanist culture that produced Pico della Mirandola's soaring vision of unlimited human freedom and dignity existed within societies that practiced slavery, that excluded women from formal education and professional life, that would soon tear themselves apart in a century of brutal religious warfare. History, even at its most inspiring, rarely offers itself up as simple, uncomplicated triumph, and the Renaissance, for all its genuine and remarkable achievements, is no exception to that pattern. And yet something real, something worth carrying with us, does remain. It remains in the quiet, patient example of scholars willing to spend decades learning a nearly forgotten alphabet in pursuit of wisdom they were not even certain still existed. It remains in the image of a goldsmith turned architect, crawling among Roman ruins for years, measuring and sketching and puzzling out principles that had lain dormant for 1,000 years, simply because he suspected the answer to an impossible problem was there, waiting, if only he looked closely enough. It remains in Leonardo's endless, unhurried curiosity, content to fill notebook after notebook with careful observations that might never be finished, never be published, never be recognized in his own lifetime, because the looking itself seemed to matter more than any final, tidy conclusion. It remains in Michelangelo's aching neck and Raphael's gathered philosophers and Titian's glowing, patient layers of translucent color, each one a small, specific testament to the idea that sustained, careful attention, given generously and patiently to a single worthy task, can produce something that quietly outlasts its maker by hundreds of years. Perhaps, in this sense, the Renaissance offers something gently useful even for an ordinary night like this one, an ordinary act like closing your eyes and letting your thoughts soften and drift. It offers the reminder that great things are rarely made quickly, that the dome above Florence took 16 slow years, one herringbone brick at a time, that a ceiling above Rome took 4 exhausting years, one aching, patient stroke at a time, that a language capable of the deepest poetry took generations of careful cultivation, one recovered manuscript at a time, that even the stars themselves, so certain and immovable in the night sky, took patient decades of solitary calculation before anyone fully understood how they moved. There is no need to accomplish anything else tonight. The dome is built. The ceiling is painted. The manuscripts have been found, copied, printed, and read by candlelight in 1,000 quiet rooms across a whole continent. All of that patient, careful work has already been done, centuries ago, by people who are long since resting themselves, and all that remains for you right now is simply to rest alongside them, in the same soft, unhurried dark that has always eventually followed every long, bright, beautiful day in human history, and that will follow this one too. Let Florence fade now, gently into shadow. Let the Arno grow quiet and still. Let the last candle in the last quiet library finally, softly, go out. Sleep well and drift onward, wherever your own dreams choose to carry you tonight. Before we let the last candle go out completely, let us spend a few final, unhurried minutes not with a famous name or a famous painting, but with an ordinary evening imagined gently, in the Florence we have been visiting all night, because it is worth remembering that beneath all the grand achievements we have traced, an entire ordinary world continued quietly on, mostly unrecorded, mostly unremarked upon by the historians who preferred to write about popes and princes and celebrated artists. Picture, if you will, a wool worker's household in one of Florence's crowded artisan districts, as the sun begins to lower over the rooftops and the bells of a nearby church mark the early evening hour. The day's work in the dye vats and combing sheds is finished, and the smell of wool grease and vegetable dye still clings faintly to workers' hands as they make their way home through narrow streets, the upper stories of the buildings leaning so close together above them that in some places only a thin ribbon of darkening sky remains visible overhead. A woman stirs a pot of thick vegetable and bean soup over a small fire, the evening's simple, humble meal, while somewhere nearby a neighbor's child practices scales on a small recorder, the notes drifting, imperfect and unhurried, out through an open shutter into the cooling evening air. This ordinary household would likely never commission a painting, never fund a chapel, never appear in the correspondence of a Medici or the notebooks of a Leonardo. And yet its members lived, breathed, worked, and dreamed within the very same city, under the very same rising dome, that we have spent so much of tonight admiring, and in small, indirect ways, their labor made that grander history possible. The wool they carded and dyed formed the very foundation of Florentine wealth. The taxes and guild dues they paid helped fund civic building projects. The children they raised became, in the next generation, apprentices in workshops, assistants to master, craftsmen, occasionally, in fortunate and unusual cases, artists or scholars themselves, the way young Michelangelo's own modest family background did not, in the end, prevent him from becoming one of the greatest sculptors history has ever known. Ordinary Renaissance life, for most people, was structured overwhelmingly by the rhythms of the agricultural and liturgical calendar, by the rising and setting of the sun, by the changing of the seasons, and by the steady cycle of feast days and fasting days that the Catholic Church wove through every month of the year. Carnival, celebrated in the weeks before the fasting season of Lent, brought weeks of public festivity, music, and elaborate costumed processions to cities across Italy, a bright, boisterous release of energy before the quieter, more austere weeks of religious reflection that followed. Markets filled city squares on regular weekly schedules, bringing farmers and craftsmen from the surrounding countryside into direct contact with urban buyers, creating the same dense, everyday web of commercial exchange that, at its highest and most sophisticated level, had also produced the great banking fortunes of families like the Medici. Education, for most children, extended little beyond basic literacy and numeracy, if it extended that far at all, and was typically oriented toward practical preparation for a trade rather than the elaborate humanist curriculum of Latin oratory and classical philosophy that occupied the sons, and occasionally daughters, of wealthier families. And yet even this practical, everyday education increasingly incorporated elements of the wider intellectual transformation we have traced tonight, as basic arithmetic instruction for merchant sons increasingly drew on newly available printed textbooks, and as the spread of printing gradually made even simple devotional pamphlets and vernacular religious texts more widely available to ordinary literate households than they had ever been before. It is worth resting gently on this wider, quieter texture of everyday life, because it reminds us that the Renaissance was never simply a story unfolding in the rarefied air of papal palaces and princely courts, however much our attention naturally gravitates toward the extraordinary individuals and achievements that have survived most vividly in the historical record. It was also, simultaneously, an ordinary world of soup simmering over small fires, of children practicing imperfect scales on borrowed instruments, of markets and festivals and quiet evening walks home through narrow, shadowed streets, all of it proceeding, evening after evening, century after century, at its own patient, unhurried pace, mostly indifferent to the grand historical narrative being written, brick by brick and brushstroke by brushstroke, in the workshops and palaces nearby. Perhaps that ordinary evening, more than any single masterpiece we have discussed tonight, is the truest resting place for us to end our journey. Because most of your own life, too, unfolds in exactly this quiet, unremarkable register. Ordinary evenings, simple meals, familiar sounds drifting through an open window, the sun lowering gradually toward a horizon that will rise again tomorrow morning, patient and unhurried, exactly as it always has. Let that ordinary Florentine evening settle fully into darkness now. The soup pot has been set aside to cool. The recorder has fallen silent. The narrow streets have emptied, and somewhere above the rooftops, Brunelleschi's great dome stands quiet and dark against a sky slowly filling with stars, keeping its patient watch over a sleeping city, exactly as it will continue keeping watch tonight, and every night, for a great many centuries still to come. Rest now. There is nothing more to see tonight, and nothing more that needs to be understood before morning. Sleep well.